and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today we're with Stephan Hammel of the Measures Taken podcast and a professor at UC Irvine. And we are going to talk about, I almost called it early socialism, but that's not actually correct. So the correct way to phrase this would be maybe early Marxism, or the Marxism between the beginning of the First International and the end of the Second. I think interest in this period has been revived because of the popularity of the works of McNair and Lars Lee, as well as some other writings around, say, Marxist humanists and other groups that are interested in early Marxism. I find this interesting in the sense that I think this period is super vital, but that our understanding of this period until literally about 15 years ago was colored completely by the events of the Third International, the dissolution of the SPA, the CPUSA's view of this time period, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we might talk about the term neo-Kautskyism because I don't know that anybody really agrees on what it means. But I think it's very interesting that we are at a time period in the socialist movement in the developed world, for the Anglophone developed world in particular, where Trotskyism, for whatever reason, in most of its guises, with a couple of exceptions that I'm not going to really go into right now, has been in rapid decline. Like, we've seen, organizations that made it through the dry period from the 50s through until the last 5 or 6 years dissolve down to 1,000 people or less, or just completely implode,
or willfully dissolve.
Yeah, or willfully dissolve because, I don't know, maybe their publishing house noticed that they couldn't hide the sex scandals anymore. Whatever. I mean,
all right, but that's not part of the historical trajectory we're trying to trace here.
No, it's not. But what is interesting is that served this role. You had the official Comintern line, which has somewhat been maintained around people who are highly attached to the CPC in China, but not really. They don't care about it nearly as much as the USSR did. And it kind of disappears in 1992, effectively, with some Chinese, interpretations that have never been very popular here, even amongst Maoists, interestingly.
Yeah, despite there being a large Maoist movement in the United States historically.
Just not that interested in post-81 Chinese view of early 20th century Marxism. And also, from what I can tell, they don't do that much with it either. Now, I might be wrong. There might be stuff that is untranslated that we don't have yet in America, but I haven't seen a whole lot of Chinese scholarship on the First and Second International.
My Chinese continues to be very rusty.
Yeah, as in mine is non-existent. I know like 10 phrases in Mandarin and 5 characters. So all that's a very long-winded preface to say, I'm interested, maybe before we get started though, why did it take so long for that to happen? Because I thought when I was reading Revolutionary Strategy the first time, what convinced me to take the book seriously, actually more than anything else, is coming out of this very Trotskyist influenced milieu, was it being pointed out that if you judge by the official doctrines of all the Trotskyist organizations to split over these minor differences of interpretation of the USSR, that if you followed their implicit logic, none of them were correct. Now, certain Trotskyist organizations have corrected their stance because their chief ideologues are still alive and have, pulled some word games to, make it seem like what they said before 1992 actually meant what happened after. But that didn't get rid of the Trotskyist movement in the West. In fact, in the immediate aftermath, in the United States in particular, but also in Great Britain, the Trotskyist movement was literally the only game in town in the Anglophone world. It was also a major player in Latin America. Why do you think that is? Like, why did it take so long for it to die when it's the modus operandi of Trotskyist still existing, separate from the larger communist movement, no longer mattered?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that Leninism is no longer a living political tendency, and for a long time, I come out of the Trotskyist movement or some variant of the Trotskyist movement, and its credibility rested in its critique of the Soviet Union. And the best, the obvious critique, the self-critique the Soviet Union made of itself was the entry of Russia back into the community of capitalist states. It turns out that the Bolshevik Revolution leads back to capitalism. So whoops. As long as Trotskyism held out a viable alternative for the interpretation of the failure of that experience, then it could exist. At least it could exist as a, at the organizational level. I think 2008 completely destroyed that. First of all, it had made so many concessions to the social movements as a result of its feeling, and this was the feeling of not unique to the Trotskyist movement, but across the left, that it had, the left as such had said goodbye to the working class. And then suddenly, after 2008, and really in the aftermath of that, when economics took center stage, which happens to be why I returned to reading Capital, actually, rather than other things in the left. I decided I needed to learn something about surplus value. Why? Because it looked like the economy turned out to be important to be a leftist. And so at that moment, Trotskyism had just made too many theoretical concessions. Trotsky himself, by the way, has no political economic theory to speak of. There isn't, there's strategic writings and there are, of course, masterful historical contributions, but, there isn't very much there. There's far more in Bukharin, there's far more in Rosa Luxemburg, even if you disagree with her, like with her theses, there's just more there. Trotskyism as a tendency had no political economic core. And because it didn't have one, it couldn't respond to the moment.
Well, one of the interesting developments that we can see post 1968, and I have my reasons for this. My field of interest is a slightly later period, it overlaps with the period of the measures taken, your podcast, and the period of study. But I am more interested in the broad array of the American left from like 1890 through, say, 1970, because I used to think when I was a post-Trot, and I'm one of these interesting individuals who somehow never ended up a Trotskyist, but was involved with two separate strains of post-Trotskyism, one of which was blatant about the fact that it was development away from Trotskyism, out of the Spartacist tradition, to be specific, and the other was really crypto about it, and you really had to dig to go, oh, these are Trotskyists who rejected the Vanguard Party. Okay. And of course, I'm talking about Marxist humanists.
Right.
But you're correct in that, in a very basic way, neither tradition actually had, and by neither tradition, I also mean the anti-revisionist tradition, mostly represented by Maoists and a few Hojists. They studiously avoided political economy. A separate Maoist political economy, for example, I actually agree with the Maoist scholar J. Paul Malford, who I don't agree with his politics, but I do think his assertion that it really wasn't developed in the West until the early 1980s. And it was developed off of like hints of things. So you had these people importing stuff from Peru and Shining Path, but also like people getting like hints of the three worlds theory of Limbao, are stuff that was insufficiently translated into any Western language, much less English, being articulated by a bunch of French American Maoist to come up with a political theory, really, kind of separate from what China was doing itself, and way after the fact. So I mean, it's interesting because what you discover if you really look at what they like Marxist Leninist Maoism, MLM, Third World Thought, is the world they're describing is already dead by the time they're describing it. Like their base assumptions are basically the post-war social compact in the United States from like 1950 to 1965, and they think they're writing as if that's still going on in the 1980s. It's actually really hilarious, but I find it interesting because the time period that you're talking about and you're most interested in is also a time period where it's really hard to talk about a fully formed, complete Marxist Hegelian political economy because, I mean, hell, in the beginnings of it, you don't even have all the capital.
Right. Yeah.
Like, much less theories of surplus value or the Grandessa are the other, the various philosophical and economic manuscripts, which admittedly are basically notes, but are really illuminating.
Yeah, for Marx's method, they can be truly illuminating. Although I think relying on their philosophical insights gets one into trouble, especially if one doesn't contextualize them in the young Hegelian movement and the reception of Hegel in the 1840s and early 50s. In fact, I've just been writing about another young Hegelian, Richard Wagner, who is pretty scary, but there are passages on just like the early Marx, and for reasons that are perfectly intelligible in terms of intellectual history.
They were on the same side on 1848 too, actually.
So. That's right. Wagner had to flee Dresden, but he ends up giving way to nationalism and the rest of it, as we well know. The point about economic conditions or world conditions is really important because I think one of the reasons that draws me to this period, one of the things that draws me to this period is precisely parallels between that moment and our moment. It feels strikingly contemporary. It feels strikingly contemporary in a way that lots of writing from the 30s and 40s doesn't. Certainly writings from the 60s don't, where you have these mass parties, where you have, large and powerful unions. None of that. None of that's really a problem. The national question, the peasant question, these things that really tore apart later forms of Marxism had just started to get going. So part of the project of the Measures Taken, I think, or at least, I don't know, part of my intellectual project in general is to go back to this moment with 2020 hindsight. You're not just doing history, but going back to this moment and, as it were, fantastically seeing what a Marxism would be if you had all of capital. Who would we have been in 1891 if we had sophisticated political economy? So I'm just as influenced actually by the really, I think, excellent, invaluable work that's been done in the interpretation of capital. I'm thinking of not just Andrew Kleiman, and other people who have focused on this in ways that aren't particularly Marxist, but useful. People talk about Anwar Sheikh, who talks about classical political economy. There's been a lot of good work, let alone, Money in Totality, and the list goes on and on. There's been excellent work on value theory. So now we can have a context for reading someone like Isaac Rubin that those who initially read or were allowed to read Isaac Rubin wouldn't have had. So that's the experiment. Let's go back in time to a moment like ours, but let's go with 2020 hindsight. See what we discover.
In some ways, I actually remember reading. I've done a lot of research on the early. When I say early Frankfurt School, I do not even mean Horkheimer and
right. That's the late Frankfurt.
Yeah, that's late. That's middle late Frankfurt School. I mean the Frankfurt School when it was in transition from Austro-Marxism, which was its classical position, into whatever the hell it became. It is interesting how much Pollock and Grossman, for example, were getting bits and pieces of Mega One research, and that if the purges hadn't happened, we would have had a much more robust Marx Engels corpus in the 1930s and 40s than we did. And this came up recently for me, and I hesitate to bring up Kleiman because of our historical antipathy, but
we don't do ad hominem in this room.
Yeah. But I was recently reading one of Kleiman's arguments with Grossman, which I agreed with Kleiman's beginnings of his logic, but there was two problems I had with it. One is I actually didn't think the math actually totally said what Kleinman said it said. And two, and that's from looking at somebody else who's playing with his numbers using Grossman assumptions. I cannot remember the person I was looking at who was doing that. And two, that one of the things that Kleinman went after Grossman for that I thought was horrendous was he said basically that Grossman tried to come up with a theory of breakdown because it was in the popular milieu, and I said, look, there were plenty of people. No, there is not a articulated theory of breakdown in Capital. All right, fine. And you can argue, although Andrew Kleinman can't argue this because he would have to admit something that he cannot admit. We can get that in a minute.
We'll get to it,
yeah. But you could argue that the Marx of the letters to Engels in the 1850s are not arguing for immiserationism. And, or they are, but that Marx changed his mind. All right.
Yeah, I think it's clear that Marx thought it was not good that capital seemed to have regained its footing in the 1850s. But the 1850s is pretty early in Marx's mature development anyway, first of all. And second, the immiseration thesis, by the way, I don't disagree with anything you said. The immiseration thesis isn't the whole of the breakdown thesis.
It's not the breakdown thesis, which I will not only echo that, but it completely changed my opinion on the breakdown thesis when I realized it was not early immiseration theory, nor was it even automatic, inevitable Hegelian inevitabilism a la classical Marxist-Leninist, or Stalinist teleological assumptions about the necessity of capital to win. I mean, it's actually quite humorous now when I see that, and then I hear about people think the Marxist humanist anti-humanist debates are somehow between like Rona Donskaya and Althusser, as if Althusser had even heard of that. But it's interesting because if you really get down to the meat of what Althusser is arguing, he's basically just taking all the Hegel stuff out of classical Stalinist assumptions.
Yeah, and adding a lot of structuralist philosophy to boot. I've never actually. I should admit something. I've spent a good deal of time studying philosophy formally, and I can make neither heads nor tails of reading Capital, and so of which I don't understand, I won't speak. But I'm glad you brought up Grossman. If the historical, it was in the popular milieu. That's not why I'm attracted to the breakdown thesis. I'm attracted to the breakdown thesis because I want a theory of what's happening right now, and it looks like what's happening right now is breakdown. 10 years of zero or less interest rates, all of my students investing in crypto. Just the massive amounts of money being poured into investments which are obviously not productive. They're just transparently not productive. Just seems to indicate that there's very little other place to put your money if you have it. And that should indicate that there's just, right. Surplus value is in trouble. It's and we can float it for, maybe forever, but.
Well, this is the key thing that I've been saying when people are like, there's no declining rate for the profits. And I'm like, okay, fine. You want to argue that there's no sound argument for declining rates of profits in Capital Volume 3. I'll even give it to you. I will give you that Marx does not fully articulate that argument because he didn't think he had to, because it was a universal assumption of classical political economy.
That's right.
This morning I was literally recording something on J.A. Hobson and pointing out that like Hobson, who did have overlap with early Marxists, but had come to the same conclusion completely independently of labor and social democracy in Britain, based purely off of observation and understanding of classical political economy and a rejection of Say's law, which he got from a fucking businessman. So like this was not only some kind of weird Marx alone innovation, which is why it was not completely explained.
That's right. Well, it wasn't argued for. So it was explained, but not argued for. So the people are like, well, I don't see a declining rate of profit. Even though, by the way, if you turn on the business news, one of their working assumptions, and it's been a working assumption, just as you say, since the early days of classical political economy, it's there in Adam Smith, that mature economies tend to decline, tend to grow slower over time. This is, there's lots of ways to explain it. Marx has an explanation. Other people have different kinds of explanations. I like Marx's explanation because I like the rest of value theory, and the beautiful thing about the declining rate of profit thesis isn't that it's predictive, it's that it demonstrates a dynamic. And he himself, by the way, that explanation is full of countervailing tendencies, and there's no way to empirically measure. I mean, there are ways to approximate, and some smarter people than me have done some excellent jobs, as far as I can tell, of approximating how much the reality matches up to what we find in Marx. But there aren't hard and fast ways to do that. These are obviously, value isn't something that you can just sort of go out the door and measure like rainwater. So anyway, look, capitalism's already over. This is the nice thing about being a Marxist today, is that you don't have to worry about the breakdown of capital, because that's basically already taken care of itself. The problem is political, which is how do we make sure that doesn't result in a kind of totalitarian fascist nightmare. And I take it that involves, that's the puzzle, and that involves looking back in time.
So, you made a assertion that would make most Marxists shit their pants, but it's something that I've been at least playing with lately, separately from you, is that we are at least in the transition are to something that does not resemble any of the major criteria. And I do take my criteria from Bernard Woods on what counts as capitalism. So I have like 4 criteria. And I will also say methodologically, you can't get this from Marx, because if you work out things dialectically from the classical tradition of dialectics, and I mean this going back like way before Hegel, this isn't like a German idealist innovation. You do not define terms in a dialectical debate, because the definition of terms is actually part of what is contested in the dialectic. Which is why you can't use it. Like you cannot do analytical philosophy dialectically, and the reason why that's important is basically in analytic philosophy, everything is decided by your set of presumptions, and you can't contest that. Whereas in dialectical philosophy, going all the way back to Aristotle, where this is spelled out, the purpose of the oppositional dialogue is for, based off the Socratic method, even for your terms to be defined by the debate itself. So like the dialectic of capital, you can't go in and with this X is what capital is, because basically what you do, and this is what capital does, is you critique it by description, but you don't actually define any key element of the thing you're trying to describe and critique. You let the definitions flow from other assumptions or other people's definitions, whatever, and pair them against each other and see which ones stick with the empirical inputs, etc. So there's a whole lot that goes into that science, right? And I don't think that I'm explaining that not to you, but to our audience, who are going to be like, well, and I'm like, this is part of what dialectics is. It's not magic. Like, but that's also why you can't look like, I'm like, okay, tell me where Marx defines what working class is.
No. Famously, he doesn't, right? So the manuscript breaks off precisely at that chapter on class. I'm working on an article called "The Musician in Class Society" right now, trying to work out where the class definitions. All kinds of problematics with that, right? Because you take any individual person, you pick them out of the world, and you try to decide what class they're in. Well, now you've got a big problem, because they're a capitalist in the morning and a wage laborer in the evening, and perhaps they're invested in some sort of fund for their retirement. Perhaps they even rent their garage apartment, and now they're suddenly petty bourgeois. That level of analysis is, well, it's not what Marx was up to, and can't be that granular. But of course, as you say, that difference between a definition and deduction-based method to a method that takes concepts as already present in the world. So I take it that Hegel and Marx follows him here, with a materialist twist, but he follows him here in saying, well, the world is already in conceptual shape when we get to it. We don't need to put it in conceptual shape through our definitions and grafting our concepts.
History is clarifying our concepts all the time. It's not like we just emerge from them full cloth. It's interesting because, the here you describe this, people miss that, like, no, that there is a radical empiricist core to this, but it is not empiricism as it is understood in the Anglosphere, because empiricism is understood in the Anglosphere comes into all kinds of circular problems of like definitions constantly. And this is an attempt to maintain that materialist core that is radically empirical in a lot of ways. So you do look at the world. And this, I say that kind of as an admonition to all these Marxists who basically poo-poo any like actual studies of anything, which is super common. But
Varn's doing more thought police than I'm doing today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I don't consider myself a neo-Kautskyist. You consider yourself some variety of it. But
yeah, we should talk about the definition in a moment.
We will in a minute. But the methodological problems led us to similar conclusions. And I realized that when I was listening to your show, particularly when you got to the problems of imperialism, which, okay, there are vagaries in it, but at least it is consistent with a kind of Marxism, particularly of the late period, to the national question, which is, okay, yeah, Marx and Engels wrote about it, but highly inconsistently and tactically, and frankly, were wrong about certain things when they I mean, from the Marx and Engels point of view, which would shock people now, Poland was supposed to be the good guy in the national question, and like, and stuff like that. So,
right.
And also Marxists who were in the tradition early enough to have at least known Engels, if not Marx, felt at liberty to still be Marxist and disagree on the national question in a way that like no one did about, say, Lassallean political economy, where like that, no, like that's a hard differentiation. You cannot believe that and be a Marxist, even though Lassalle thought he was, at least until the end.
You bring up a really good point. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, sorry to interrupt, but you bring up a really good point, which is, okay, so, we just talked about how under a truly dialectical philosophy, you don't need definitions, but let me for a moment define, what a Marxist ought to be. When we're talking about the Marxist tendency, it's the Marxist tendency in the labor movement. It's that Marxist tendency that says the working class has a world historical mission. It just happens to have one, and and because of our analysis of world history, we understand that labor movement has this trajectory to overthrow the existing relations of production in society. That stems from a political economic analysis. Okay, so why are there all these other things about, just as you say, the national question or imperialism, which I have to say it's even more annoying than the national question to me, because imperialism often is presented as if it were an offshoot of political economy, although more often than not, in my view, at least my experience, it just becomes a sort of catch-all term for everything that's bad and that happens overseas. But nonetheless, those things are grafted onto Marxism because Marxism is understood as Leninism. Well, once you abandon Leninism, then all of that stuff at least stops being dogma. And the only thing that I think we all need to agree on is 3 volumes of Capital. And now we can go.
I would add to that, it's really helpful to understand theories of surplus value.
Sure, 4 volumes. Okay, all right.
Yeah,
we'll do 4 volumes.
The reason why I say that is like categories that, for example, Maoists abuse because they kind of understand it but haven't read all of theories of surplus value to clarify it, is stuff like productive versus unproductive labor. And if you read theories of surplus value, it's very clear productive is productive towards capital. It has no relationship to social necessity at all.
Yeah, come on. This is really truly. Oh, and people do crazy things with like fixed and constant capital. Yeah, productive, unproductive labor. That which of course they become these code words for petty fights about what the correct party line ought to be in the small organization with respect to XYZ contemporary event. The kind of, and this is true of the Trotskyist movement, in my experience, all too true, which is, we really need to have a take. More important than anything else is that every single thing that happens, we have to have a take.
Even if it leads to a totally incoherent political economy or geopolitics, it doesn't make any damn sense.
Or a split.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, there's the other reason for that, because after the Second International, you start seeing the ban on factions. The ban on factions means that any substantive disagreement would thus mandate a split, whereas the broad spectrum of what's allowable in Marxism, I mean, in the early 20th century, in the first decade of the 20th century, Bogdanov, Bukharin, Bernstein, a bunch of proto-Nazis, Daniel Day DeLone, all can legitimately claim to be part of international Marxism.
Yeah.
And they disagree on tons of things. The only one who disagrees on value theory, from what I can tell, is Bernstein. And I also, this is out of the period of you've been talking about, but even Stalinist until 1951, with the economic problems of the Soviet Union comes out, and Stalin abandons value abolition. Which is how Dungists justify their critique, but that's a very late move, even in Stalinism. We are talking deathbed Stalin, and it's also inconsistent, by the way, with the Stalinist focus on autarky in the prior 2 decades.
You just said something interesting, which is, they all have a legitimate claim to Marxism, and that's a legitimate claim based on the definition I just gave, which is 4 volumes of Capital, and not everything else we debate about. All those people did not equally understand capital.
No, not remotely.
But it doesn't matter.
Some of them are wrong.
It doesn't matter for these purposes. I mean, it matters tremendously, but it doesn't matter for these purposes, because for these purposes, they agreed that value theory mattered centrally, even if they, and they did, right? Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg thought completely different things were true about political economy, but neither of them would have said what we really need to do is a cultural analysis of alienation.
Right. Which they would have thought was laughable. And to give Bernstein credit, which I've only known 2 shows to do, yours and then Real Abstractions also has done this. And I think the Endnotes Collective has done this from their post-Marxist way. They wouldn't call themselves Marxist, but they clearly are. There is a sense in which Bernstein was responding to a prediction that, based off of Kautsky's interpretation of Engels and Capital, should not have happened. Part of that is because Kautsky took parts of Engels out on the democratic question, which was historically interesting. That he did not so much contradicted him as softened Engels. So this brings us to Neo-Kautskyism now, because you and I both think that Kautsky is a crucial figure in understanding what is going on right now, and that Kautsky is both the grand hero and, in my mind, also kind of the accidental villain of
tragic hero. Come on,
right? So if you dialectically combat that, the sublimation is tragic hero.
Come on, he's not Paul Atreides. What are we doing?
Well, he kind of is. It comes to fascism, but
we'll have to wait on that episode. But we agree. Look, Kautsky is unavoidable. He's absolutely unavoidable. You know what we need? I wonder if we're going to get this from the Marxism Translated series. And I should do my own shout out to them because they're doing extraordinary
Thank
work.
God for them, because it's so many key early social democratic documents. I'm like, why the hell don't we have this in English? Why do I only have Trotsky's interpretation of Lenin's interpretation of this thing, and no one's translated the German, which is not a particularly hard language. It's not like it's in Swahili. I can find Urdu poems from the 8th century, and I can't get some of these texts.
Yeah, it's completely madness. No, I mean, what's translated, what's not, is completely baffling. In fact, one of the things we ran into, just as a side note, in the National Question research for the National Question episode, we of course made our way through Bauer's beautiful, if mostly wrong, book on the nationalities, and that's published by the University of Minnesota Press, which of course is a terrible red flag. No, listen, everything Marxism Translated, I'm happy to contribute to their Patreon so I can read everything that they publish right when it's published. But I take it that the impetus behind that is precisely the death of Leninism that we were just talking about. What happens after the death of Leninism? Well, what's the only other Marxism that you can fall back on? It's Kautsky's Marxism, because he was so central in codifying its theoretical commitments, or in clarifying what its theoretical commitments ought to have been, at least up until, I don't know where you want to stop. I don't know where you want to turn him into a sandworm. Maybe it's in 1914, maybe it's I don't know what it is.
I turn on to Sam Worm at 1914 and then give him back credit when him and Bernstein oppose the actual right-wing social democrats, which is something that I think people also miss because of the polemics made by Lenin at Kautsky. Polemics that in the beginning I think were actually fair, even if Lenin was misrepresenting Kautsky's position, partly ironically due to democratic centralism, and thus Kautsky not wanting to out who voted for what, and imply disunity in the Social Democrats. That's a
complexity I don't know about, actually. You're going to have to tutor me on that detail later.
Well, part of the claim made, and this was repeated, you can find it in like scholarly published Trotsky and Maoist professorate books claiming that Kautsky voted for the war credits. I actually had a German worker, weirdly, email me randomly and tell me why they got away with that claim for so long. And that was because they would not out who voted for what, and also formally Kautsky sat on his hands, and under the principle of democratic centralism, so that there does not seem to appear to be this unity in the party that's causing it to split, which is a principle that was never held in the International too, which I think is important.
Important about why they failed. But I was about to say I love that discipline. That's extraordinary. I hope to be vilified by history for my secret heroic deeds.
Right. So his sitting on the hand to keep the party unified was not widely reported. And so the ability to claim that he voted for the war credits, even though it was in the record that he did not, was really easy to make. But I've seen it in at least 3 different books that were published before 1910. After Lars Lee and McNair and the real push to go back and actually look at what the social democratic documents say and what the Congress has actually wrote down in their records, that is an untenable position. But I have seen it repeated, which leads people, particularly people who were half educated, like they get a little bit from their sect and a little bit from the internet, to believe that somehow Kautsky was directly tied, and Bernstein too, directly tied to, say, the faction of the Social Democrats that were tied to the proto Freikorps and the official government, which you can kind of accuse Hilferding maybe of indirectly, but there's no other major social democratic figure that we remember who was actually on that side. Yes, that side actually does become the core of the left wing of fascism. It does. Also something that Marxists don't like talking about because it contradicts Trotsky's somewhat true and somewhat idiotic assertion that, fascism is just capitalism and decay. And I love when they attribute that to Lenin, because I'm like, Lenin died in 1927. Yes, there were fascists, but like who's going to have a very adroit understanding of the early fascist movement from Russia in 1926? Like,
well, I mean, they might have had a better one than a contemporary would-be Marxist would get from the internet. I take it that maybe that's changing now with the efforts of people we've already mentioned, but I take it that getting your Marxism from the internet is a little like getting your cancer diagnosis from WebMD.
yes.
It's always going to come up the same, and it's always going to be wrong, and it's always going to make you a hysterical, annoying person.
Agreed.
But anyway, no, look, we should talk about why it matters. I mentioned the Marxism Translated Project just because the one thing I wish they'd get to is the class struggle, which we only have in its, I think it's like an early 20th century. There's like a Norton paperback edition of this thing, which just also makes me not want to buy it. And it's not only an old translation, it's an abridged translation, that's just unforgivable. We don't have the intellectual justification of the Erfurt program. We don't even have the ABCs of communism, the intellectual justification of the Soviet program, the initial one. In anything like a modern edition, it's just out of print. My copy is like this tattered ex-library thing, which is madness. So our libraries are just starting to get full right at the moment. And that's very exciting because, I mean, who knows what we're going to discover or what lessons we'll be able to take away after this. And by the way, how many sacred cows we can leave bleeding on the floor in the process, which might not be, I mean, other than being intellectually stimulating, will be emotionally cathartic for me.
Yeah, my favorite one is somehow we're going to have the international by spreading nationalism. And then, oh, wait, there's all these nationalisms who oppose socialism all of a sudden. We don't understand how that happened, even though we totally even invented some of these nationalisms to like.
I was just listening last night. I was listening to a truly infuriating podcast that I won't name, but it was a long discussion of the concept of decoloniality, something I've been studiously ignorant of for a lot of years. And all of it boiled down to, and in my mind, the back of my mind, listening to this thing, and it's like, well, this sounds very academic and very jargony, and I don't really know where all of this is going. It seems more interested in well-placed emotional feelings of guilt than it does in a political program that has a hope of winning or arguing for constituency. And then right at the end, it was Lenin would have been a decolonialist because of his position on the national question. And so you're like, aha, exactly. And of course, what's the political upshot? We should be careful about solidarizing with neo-nationalist movements, and of which I take lots of, the bourgeois versions of anti-racism, the bourgeois versions of indigeneity, et cetera, repatriation. They even acknowledge, well, we're creating, and making alliances with people who will be enemies of the working class tomorrow. But for today, we will not only support them, but we will be careful not to solidarize too hard in order not to confuse their struggle with ours.
One of the most fascinating things I think about this has come up in your show, but it's also come up in my own thinking, is pointing out the difference of, quote, progressive nationalism, in so much that it was ever progressive, and breaking up pre-modern, semi-absolutist or early modern empires that had not fully bourgeoisified, that were not capitalist, properly speaking. And that is part of the logic of Marx and Engels there. Well, that doesn't really apply at all in modern anti-imperialism. I also find it hilarious. I mean, I have studied decolonization very seriously, and it actually led me to your position, but from a complete, like almost from the opposite take.
Oh yeah.
But that there was no good way to pick, because one of the debates in African decolonization, which is a debate between some like very Chinua Achebe versus various tribal nationalists who pointed out that the idea of Nigeria, or the idea of even the nation, qua the nation, is a colonial concept, and that the national question is actually in and of itself from a European framework, and Achebe's answer is kind of a cop-out. Well, like, we can't have political unity without a collective actor, and the only collective actor we can agree on is actually the European nation state. And insofar that is the case, because we are also fragmented in language, we should actually embrace decolonizing English as opposed to revitalizing all of our native languages, because it would create disunity and break up our ability to act as a collective actor, and thus assert any political will against the imperialist framework. And I was like, so you literally just spelled out an impossibility of decolonization, that like the entire decolonial framework is actually solely dependent on accepting colonial frameworks that you could not remove from either your mental landscape or actual political reality without risking, total vulnerability to another imperial process. And that times arrow moves in one direction, and you can't turn it around. Now, Achibe would not admit, that this was a problem for decolonization, but it is.
Oh no, it's a terrible problem for decolonization. I should say that I don't know that we have any hope of removing any ideas from people's minds without changing their conditions. At least nothing that doesn't look like the end of 1984 or something. But are there good or bad nationalisms? I take it that if you look at the nationalist revolutionary experiences that I'm most familiar with are in Latin America. They just happen to be. My parents were Chilean exiles as kids, and I grew up in a kind of pro-Allende household, thank God. Gave me a lot of political perspective early on, protected me from some bourgeois influences, I guess. But look, it's, okay, national, because what you're trying to take over is the state at hand, but international immediately, and part of a global project, of course. And, it didn't mean let's make common cause with the national bourgeoisie. Even if you take Otto Bauer's position on national self-determination, which we really like in the United States, we like all kinds of Bauer in the United States, without knowing really where any of this comes from, which is Austro-Marxism, which is okay. But the national minorities need control over culture. And of course, culture is always and everywhere a metaphor. What do we mean when we say culture? We mean the schools, we mean the newspapers, we mean the radio stations and television stations, to put a fine point on it, we mean the means of production. If it's in control of a national body, that means private property in the means of production. You can't get away from that. Even if you restrict it to cultural national self-determination, what that means, you're going to have to protect that in some way. So suddenly you're pro-private property, even when your interests were liberatory. We should also say that your last point about political strategy, about how it undermines itself at the level of strategy, I think that's already more sophisticated than we're getting from a lot of this discourse, which only measures its position against either an abstract ethics or, more commonly, against their own commitments, the set of their own pre-established commitments, and then ends it there, satisfied with consistency.
Yeah, I would say it's funny because it's something that I came back to the Marxist position. I actually had this long debate with Doug Lane on this one day, that I came back to what I consider the classical Marxist position, and be like, most of this is going to become irrelevant under socialism, and what isn't going to be a problem for us. But I mean, literally, this is what I just think. I remember thinking, like, okay, you want to grant everybody their land back. What arbitrary period in time are you going to decide is the rightful claimant of land?
Right.
Okay.
Are we doing blood tests now?
You're already going back 300 something years. No, you're going back 700 years before the European settler colonial projects. But let's not end there. Like, do I kick anyone of Anglo-Saxon heritage out of the UK, and people will go, well, that's not modern, so it doesn't count. That's not part of capital accumulation. And I'm like, it was part of what created the nation state of England, which allowed for capital accumulation in the transition from the Kingdom of England, which it still technically kind of is, to the modern nation state that it sort of kind of is as well. And that there is no simple adjudication on any lines on this, because for obvious reasons,
for obvious reasons,
like Spain. Okay, so I remember telling someone, on one hand we're supposed to be internationalists, and on the other hand I'm supposed to be like, yes, I think the Spanish government is doing shitty things to the Catalonians that they should not do. Do I think that that means that Catalan is a viable nation state? No. Why would I be pro Balkanization of anything? It worked out so well for the Balkans.
Yeah, we often think that, if without national self-determination of some kind, and I'll acknowledge that there are many different variants of this, without some kind of national self-determination, we won't, it'll just be that these minorities will be rolled over by perhaps some nightmare of some Friedrich Pollock-like nightmare of a bureaucracy or some other demon. And I take it that that's a question I'm far more flat-footed about it. Is it the case that under socialism, products will only be made that appeal to the majority? That just doesn't seem likely. For example, diabetics are a minority, but I doubt that a social society would stop making insulin.
Yeah,
and for
I
the
highly
same
doubt
reason,
we stop making stuff for people who can't work.
Right. We're still going to make the cultural goods that I consume, books in French and gay pornography. We're still going to make those things that are necessary for the full flowering of a minority. All kinds of different languages and the various kinds of music that there will be. I mean, you'll decide democratically about how that's made and how that's distributed. But I just take it that it's not a worry. Just as you say, these things will take care of themselves, precisely because we'll have common ownership of the means of production. I take it that they won't take care of themselves at all if we have private control of the means of production, especially if that private control is based on an ideology of nationhood or, I just don't see how there isn't not even a slippery slope, just an immediate conversion into chauvinism.
Well, not only do I think that's inevitable, I actually have been pointing out for years that Engels, towards the end of his life, makes a very big deal out of pointing out that nationalization, while it may be necessary in the transition to socialism, it is not and cannot be said to be the same thing as socialization. Which when I throw this at, like, even liberals are like, well, what are you just want national? Like, actually, honestly, no, I don't just
it's
want
kind of the opposite
of production, because I don't think nation states should exist.
Right.
So, like, and they're like, I thought you were a Marxist. Yes, I'm a Marxist. I believe that the state is class, that the nation state is a bourgeois class state, that you might have something like a state in a dictatorship of the proletariat, because the proletariat would be a class state. However, that in and of itself is also not the goal. Like, the goal is not the instantiation of the dictatorship of the proletariat for all time, because that logically institutes that there is a fundamental separation of classes that cannot be separated, that people,
that's right, or else the state would have no other basis upon which to have its little army of bandits that can shoot you or put you in jail or throw you into a torture chamber or whatever.
So, I mean, which implies that there is still classes, which implies that there's still division of labor, which, division of labor that is enforced, not organic, which I do think the organic division of labor will still happen. But, so as long as those conditions are there, we don't have even socialism by the definition of the Critique of the Goethe program, or even by the definition of the road to power. So, to give Kautsky some credit, he realizes this.
Where I've read this, by the way, a book that may have flown below your radar, if any book these days has flown below your radar, which is I just stumbled on it because we were doing theory of the state. The nice thing about starting this podcast is I thought it was well read in Marxism, and then you discover just how completely not well read. There's always that book that it's unforgivable that you haven't read yet. But anyway, I made my way through Emile van der Velde's. He's a Belgian socialist. Because he has an anti-Stalinist position people associate with all kinds of political tendencies. And I'm not sure it's important to identify, but he has a book called The State versus Socialism, in which he says not only is statification of industry not what we're after, it's the opposite of what we're after. And this is Mike McNair makes the same point when he says that state possession of the means of production is private possession of the means of production. So we can't be for that.
The state is private. Like, if there is a distinction in citizenship, it is private. The public in socialism is everyone. Like,
that's right.
Like, not the people who happen to be arbitrarily in his historical division line of this imagined community that we have and have enforced by gunpoint for X number of hundreds of years, which is almost always only X number of hundreds of years. Sorry, countries that try to claim that somehow that there's a continuity of government because there's a continuity of culture for 6,000 years. That doesn't flow.
No, it
remotely.
doesn't. Yeah,
remotely.
I'm going to reject any explanation that has as its cause something called culture.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you love a lot of the claims of expatriate Chinese communists. Most of them are well off, by the way, who will tell you that Confucian culture was necessary for the full blooming of communism that happened because it had the social harmony. I was like, had the social harmony for class collaboration, which is the exact thing that we said socialism wasn't.
Yeah, oh god, which is just more national chauvinism. And you know that we've been, before even Marxism, we've been fighting this. I mean, in the 1820s, 18 teens, right after Napoleon's invasions in Germany, you have a split between, Hegel himself was a kind of, he was lots of things, but he wasn't a national chauvinist. He wasn't Fichte. He wasn't Schelling. Or Schleiermacher, I should say. I don't know of any truly incriminating piece of work by Schelling, but I'm sure someone will remind me of. But which is to say that, and the Young German movement, all of which was heavily nationalistic and which scared the living daylights out of Hegel because he understood exactly where it was going. So yeah, no, I take all of this as truly, truly dispiriting. One of the things that, my strategy with it though, is almost not to argue with it, which is, the beautiful thing about this moment, post-Leninist moment of Marxism, is that you don't have to argue down the theses that were inherited from Leninism. You could just brush them nicely aside and try to solve other harder problems, mostly in political economy and revolutionary strategy.
So while I agree with that in theory, in practice, what I have found is because these positions are no longer viable, they are easy to project upon and become easy identities for people to adopt. So I've actually found myself arguing more and more ridiculous positions that are like half-assed appropriations of like, I'm a Chinese communist and I'm a Lassallean explicitly. Or I'm like, and I was like, at least you admit it. Check.
That brings us to the point about names. We should how we name tendencies is interesting. I've been thinking about this because we said before about like what's a neo-Kautskian. I don't love the term, by the way, and one of the reasons
I don't think anybody loves the term.
No one likes it. No one likes it. And the first thing I want to point out about it is that it does not name what I called Leninism earlier, which is a living political tendency. I think Maoism was a living political tendency. I think Folkismo in Latin America was one. I think that, the DSA's democratic socialism, for all my disagreements with it, is at least a living political tendency. I don't think neo-Kautskianism means that, actually. It's something like, it's a tendency in search of life. As it were. It only describes an attitude toward the history of Marxism. It does not describe a political movement.
Right, which is actually clarifying to get back on to this focus on this period. Because if I was to survey neo-Kautskyus, I would get everyone from Bhaskar Sankara used to be really influenced by it, believe it or not. He read revolutionary strategy and was all into Austro-Marxism. I don't get it from his actions, but I happen to know people who know him, and I have been reassured that is part of his belief set.
Cool.
All the way to Cosmonaut, which ranges from, I would say, soft Leninist, and I say soft Leninist because they're not. Leninism and Marxist Leninism, for those who are not initiated, is code words. Mm-hmm. Leninism is Trotskyism. Right. Marxist Leninism
is Stalinism.
Marxist Leninism is Stalinism. Marxist Leninism, Maoism is one interpretation of late Mao, which is against the other interpretation of Mao, which has now become predominant, which is the Dengist interpretation of Mao. Also, if you know anything about modern Chinese history, most of this is bullshit. I will say, even more than Stalin, Mao is very hard to get anything like a coherent theory of action or political economy out of. You get basically a coherent theory of warfare, and that is about it.
It's a little like Che Guevara's contribution, actually, which is an exquisite theory of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, and Che Guevara has a very interesting theory. Has interesting theories on the national question, also, that actually do legitimately try to address both Chinese and Russian chauvinism that was manifested even though he was a Marxist-Leninist. He was complaining about that, and also that there were real problems that you weren't going to be able to get around with, like, well, if we grant everybody who speaks, if we look at the criterion even established by Stalin on what counts as a nation, like
right, his criteria, his definition,
right, then wow, we're going to have to like have national autonomous zones for, like, micro tribes, basically, which is even clearer, and it's clearer in Latin America because also bourgeoisification is happening later.
And the sheer number of indigenous societies that still exist in Latin America. I mean, it's a totally different situation. Yeah.
Right. So now I posited this question to an indigenous rights friend of mine, and I was like, okay, you reject Marxism because of Marx's critique of pre-industrial societies, and but let's say, fine, the socialists say, give you a portion of your land, complement to the surviving parts of your population. You have it. You have total sovereignty. They don't make you be socialist and do whatever the hell you want. You're going to have no, however, trading partners with the socialist world, because they don't do that. And you might have enough land to eke out subsistence living, but we're also not going to close off freedom of movement from people leaving your area into ours, so you can maintain your population by fiat. How long do you think that society will last?
No, it disappears entirely. And in fact, one of the worst things about this discourse, not that it's omnipresent, but that it crops up
it's
often.
It's pretty omnipresent, frankly.
Oh, no. I was going to say, the thing I'm going to say in a second is not quite omnipresent, which is, you get the sense that once you decommodify, land and things and return them to their natural patrimony, the word patrimony doesn't inspire a shiver in anyone but me, but back to their patrimony, then they'll, the harmonious society that pre-existed capitalism would flower back up again. That's, I don't know. That's just like transparently Orientalist or something. The idea that once you remove capitalism, a more natural form of economy will spring up like a flower. There's just no reason to assume that. Unless you're enthralled to some really weird literature.
I mean, there is some literature that literally tries to argue that all this is really, like, biologically a problem of bio-white people. I believe it or not, luckily that literature is rare even amongst most identitarians, but it does exist.
I love that. I have the James Baldwin line on this, which is that the problem is people think there are white people.
Right. No, I completely agree. My problem, I was talking to some black friends of mine, and we were talking about the Black Belt thesis, and I'm like, okay, fine. What do you do with my family? What do you mean? We're intermarried. Like, we're intermarried. Like, the mixed kids, do we let them pick? Like, do we institute blood quotient? Like, what about white passing people because they have white skin privilege? They white pass. I mean, what do we do? And
right,
just auto shutdown, and which also tells me they're not serious about it. They're not actually serious about it. Yeah. They don't really believe it.
Yeah.
Like that's the obvious implication of this, because we go like, okay, under socialism, we're going to get rid of the wealth disparity that has developed because of the historical accumulation of chattel slavery and capital, which is a world historical abomination. Totally agree. But the only way to get rid of that is to get rid of private property and inheritance. And there's only a few ways to do that, one of which is our way. Um,
Yeah, I don't know what the other the other ways all sound scary.
The other ways are scary.
Yeah, no. Obviously, we have to do away with inheritance, which means that there's no such thing as patrimony. I mean, nothing, not in a socialist political vision. It's also. I mean, speaking of Lassalleanism, it feels a little like the problem is injustice because the worker is not remunerated the full value of his labor.
Fuck justice. I don't give a shit.
And I'm like,
justice.
Oh, I don't either. Justice is just simply not a Marxist category. Also, and this is might be. I started out the university. I should say this: the university poisons everybody's brain, and mostly does a horrible job of, purposefully does a horrible job of educating elites. But one of the things that it does is it convinces people that there's, there are ethical norms that they should abide by. You should just see the emails.
Some vague notion of human rights, which also somehow seems to change every 10 years.
Totally.
Even though they're inalienable and based on natural law, which we don't believe in, and also would fall apart if we were actually consistent with a utilitarian calculus.
Totally.
I'm not a utilitarian, by the way, like at all. But like if you applied it remotely to this discourse, which people try, but they're dishonest about it, it's just like, well, why should anyone respect any? I mean, like, I guess ultimately, yes, you can make the argument that in the world historical, community of beings, then from a utilitarian standpoint, then most of them are brown, I suppose. And so then I guess some kind of,
but who knows what that means?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean
consequences follow from that.
I was going to say, like, brownness is a racial category of it's actually a very late racial category of modernity. It's not even one of the early ones.
And you wouldn't want to plan an economy on its basis simply because there are no races.
Right.
So, they don't cause anything, and they cannot be the basis for economic planning. And so they're just a really troubling category when it comes to Marxism. So I don't like morals, and I don't like justice. And I think that if you can build your politics without either, then you shouldn't have either.
I have a conception of morality that I think is implicit in parts of Marx, which is based on virtues, but virtues have nothing to do with the way we modernly talk about morality, because they're just traits that you emulate off of material success to produce a certain kind of person. And
I mean, I'm for flourishing.
Yeah. And I mean, so like when we talk about like I remember in Prolet Cult used to talk about this, like you talked about what are, if we came up with our own virtues, what would proletarian virtues be versus like bourgeois virtues? I think that discourse is interesting. But I would also say, like, fuck, we're nowhere near that. I would tell you that the other problem that it engenders, and this is a problem that I come from the working class. I say that because everybody claims that. I come from the working class by the liberal definition of the term, meaning that my parents were, one of them has an associate's degree and the other one got a degree at 40, but they were effectively blue collar workers. I bring it up because the way I hear people talk about workerism, I'm like, do you understand the pathologies of poverty amongst the working class? Like, we don't believe what we believe about the working class because we think the working class is inherently good.
No.
Like, there's no implication of that in Marxism whatsoever.
It's not even desirable to be a member, by the way. It's unpleasant, for example, and it includes a lot of oppression, and risk,
and a lot of things that are stupefying.
That's right. Your life expectancy goes. It's bad. It's bad for you. I mean, no. It's that we actually have developed insights about the historical trajectory of economies, and that there are real consequences to the development of technology that have to do with social relations, and there are political goals that you can formulate by virtue of your insight into history, which have very little to do with, proletarian, the value of being a proletarian. It's anyone who's sane wants to escape the working class, and I take that that's perfectly reasonable.
I would say that if you don't, then I don't know. Like every now and then I meet these like petite bourgeois hobbyists who start talking about the moral necessity of labor, and I'm like, it's because you have total control over labor. Yeah, sure. I mean, it is good to make stuff with your hands, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the working class, and never has been.
You bring up a really good point, actually. So I've done a lot of thinking about this because there are different forms of labor, and the different forms of labor. So here's you want my least popular opinion on my podcast?
Yeah, you've already said that capitalism is already dying or dead, and that
already over.
The question is, it's a waste of time. What's the most unpopular position that you possibly have, Stephen? Because you have more than me. So.
Hey, so okay, so here, let me try this one on you. Hey, you've been terribly agreeable, I have to say.
Because we've been thinking about similar problems for about the same amount of time. We also come out of different points of a similar political tradition, one that we both reject, but still.
That right, yeah. Either that, or we both conform to gender and age stereotypes, which is probably true for probably also true. But no, okay. So here's my least popular opinion. In society, what does it mean for capitalism to be to have prevailed? Mm-hmm. Does that mean that, as we find in some sections of the Grundrisse, that every kind of all of human labor in that society becomes colored by it? And Marx comes very close to saying this in the Grundrisse, and something he did not publish, I should say. Or does it just control those industries, let's call them industries, broadly conceived, those aspects of the human productive mechanism at the social level that are vital for the reproduction of species and for us to live normally and to flourish, et cetera, at our level of technology? Okay, so I take it that there's that. At what point, as industry after industry becomes capitalistic, at what point does it prevail? I think that's a meaningless question. Instead, there's lots of human labor that isn't capitalistic or isn't anything at all. For example, there's in order for us to all wear shoes, a huge amount of shoe tying labor needs to get done. This is not the sort of thing that's going to be automatable. It's not the sort of thing that's really amenable to capital subsumption. There's lots of aspects of human labor that just ought not to be socialized. And therefore, in a social society, we can look forward to, as you say, using your hands, to cooking for yourself and getting good at all kinds of crazy, cool, productive things that meet individual needs, which are still important and don't disappear in socialism. But other things that really ought to be socialized, because that's the best way, the most efficient way for them to be produced, those ought to be run in as part of a socialist economy. So I take it that it's not just, and this is the other argument against statification, we don't just want to take all those capitalist industries and make them socialist industries. We want to diminish the number of social labor hours entirely so that we can have the rest of our lives to be productive in, and mostly for ourselves and for our loved ones and for our little communities that we feel chauvinistic about.
Right. The idea, I sometimes, this is a definition I don't entirely agree with, but I think people should consider the beginnings of communism as a reduction of work. And people who do not, and notice I'm not anti-workerist in that I realize that yes, there will still be socially necessary labor that we all have to participate in, and no one really wants to take out the fucking trash. And so there's going to be things that we deal with probably by sortition that you're going to have to do that you're not going to like. But the idea is, as a socially guiding principle, to minimize that as much as possible, and then to remove the need to talk about growth or degrowth, which is another thing, because that is only relevant in a capitalist economy. So we don't have to grow or degrow because
nothing grows.
Because everything is based on trying to maintain certain kinds of we are producing for some kind of social surplus, but not a lot, and it is also not going to any individual person, and that's the whole fucking point. So
I heard your contribution to that Swamp Side episode, by the way. Thank you for reading a book that I don't plan to read. One of the most useful things about that podcast is that I'm so glad I know people who read books that have absolutely no intention of reading unless I'm forced. But yeah, I mean, this is the same problem about work. You know, I once had this debate with I used to write with a guy early on in my career, and we used to have all kinds of debates about this. He's also a Marxist and much smarter than I am. But we were arguing about unpleasant work. You ever been at a just a get together with friends and some unpleasant piece of work needs to be done in order for the evening to move on? Mm-hmm. What naturally happens? Everyone wants to do the unpleasant work. Why? Because because there's because it feels good to do it. So that kind of self-sacrifice. I think that there's lots of reasons to expect that the permanence of unpleasant, dangerous, but necessary labor won't be hard to staff. No, but anyway, that's just an intuition of mine.
I suspect that. I mean, because there's whole categories of labor that we have. There are going to be some things that are unpleasant and dangerous that are left over from the capitalist world because we're going to have to store all this fucking nuclear waste somewhere. Stuff like that. But in general, no, I don't think. The other thing I think they underestimate. I do think, for example, every cook may be able to govern, but I don't think every cook can run a nuclear power plant. Which I always found interesting that we would throw that around. This is a Lenin hangover thing because also clearly Lenin did not actually act as if he believed this. But Marx makes explicit that human difference is innate. It is not. It is, sometimes he plays with the ideas that it's geographic and like there are geographic differences between people, which is hilarious. And which I'm glad we don't have to keep all elements of everything Marx says as holy gospel because this stuff is wrong. But basically his examples in Krieg of the Goethe program, they were very clear. Their difference is an individual. Disability is a thing. There's no way to handle disability fairly.
Disability, age, man. I mean,
age, body types, like all these things.
All kinds of things.
Liberals throw this out at us as in. I just find it funny because Marx admits it. Marx totally. It's like the goal is to make as much of that irrelevant as possible, and that's also why you don't take from people more than they can give.
That's right. That's precisely right. I think that there are distributed capacities. Everybody has to be guaranteed some measure of social production. Just because there are children and old people, there are going to be people who are not contributing to social labor, but nonetheless have to be entitled for us to just exist as a human species, have to be entitled to an amount of social production. So, I take it that we have to solve the problem immediately. Critique of the Goethe program is going to have a model about putting in labor and taking out labor.
You get the labor tokens model of like the way those are the elements of capitalist accounting is basically the element that survives. What's funny is people read that, and I've even heard left communists read this. Are people who think they're left communists. Not gonna name names here, but who read that and go, well, Marx says that the market will still exist in early phases of capital. I'm like, no, that's not what he says. He says elements of bourgeois production would still exist. From his talk about labor tokens, now I find most labor token schemes to be kind of laughable, but from his talk about labor tokens, I think what he means is accounting. Like it is not a market.
That's right. Plus, what counts as an hour of labor cannot be an hour of labor. It's going to have to be there have to be criteria that are decided on democratically about what counts as an hour of labor, even if we want to take on that model, which I'm not convinced that we do want to take on that model. But just because the first thing to decide, of course, is what's social labor and which social labor we want to undergo and which we don't. Lots of labor that is performed socially now is unnecessary. And this is like the only thing I agree with David Graeber, may he rest in peace, on, which is, There are bullshit jobs, and they're going to go away. Lots of call center jobs. I don't know if you've seen Sorry to Bother You, but this is my favorite way to get completely non-Marxist sort of in the door. Lots of things wrong with it, but some nice things right with it. One of the things that's right with it is that it foregrounds jobs that no one need perform. And the economy's full of those. In fact, as capitalism died, one of the things that it did was that it staffed all these nonsense service jobs. There's just that. It's just ridiculous.
Well, the amount of any society now, regardless of where you're at, that is administrative, is a little bit staggering. And when you look at what the administrative is competent in and can do, despite education, credentials, and pay, as COVID has made very clear. And now, no, not all societies are equal. I would totally say the managerial elites of China are way better than our managerial elites. Not gonna lie. But
yeah, if you think that the state has an administrative function, look at how badly the state administers. Administers awful.
But even saying that, like the competence of China is somewhat overstated. After all, like they didn't tamp this down in the first place.
Just look at Evergrande. Holy hell.
Yeah.
Oops.
So you want to tell me that we're going to take that bureaucracy and somehow more of that under some vague notion of democratic control, and good fucking luck on democratically controlling an unaccountable bureaucracy of anything, of any system ever. Why in rebellions all the way back to ancient societies, they didn't rebel against the king that much. They killed all the damn bureaucrats. Yeah. And unfortunately, a trait of a lot of leftists and a lot of even people who think they're Marxist is this weird love of bureaucracy. Like it is absolutely bizarre. Like, did all of you guys just get desk jobs at the academy, and that's why you're all idiots about this?
Well, yeah. I mean, speaking of the academy, you're talking about an industry. I guess medicine is the other big one, but the university, which I'm familiar with, just because it's my place of employment. Which, I mean, like every good Marxist, you're supposed to despise your place of employment. I did nothing all year but beg my students to revolt, and it was the graduate students who revolted in the end. But anyway, the level of political immaturity among the generation to follow, which, as you rightly put the other day, is a material condition. This younger generation, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I know that's my most unpopular position, is that millennial and Zoomer socialism is a fucking joke because these kids are uneducated even in their own society, and attempts to deny that are endemic and systemic. And they are actually led by bureaucratic elites who want to take their. And I know when I say bureaucratic elite, everyone freaks out. They think I'm being some kind of Republican or something. But I'm being very serious here. Who are literally using disparities between minority groups, mostly racial, to remove all accountability for their own failure.
This is 100% true. In fact, the number of times I've seen. By the way, this is a common strike-breaking tactic. You go into a workplace that's threatening to hold a union vote, and the first thing that the bosses do is set up some diversity committee, and then the workers go to war against one another. And
Carnegie perfected it and actually made the Manx white by doing it literally.
It's a version of Vanderbilt's thesis about his strategy to defeat the working class in every case. And I think it's the basic thesis of every boss fight, which is, I think Vanderbilt said this, I don't care if it's true or not, it's still insightful. At any moment, I can hire half the working class to kill the other half.
Yeah. And it's worked. I mean, the major statistic that people like, I'm not even going to get into. My friend Pascal Robert finally took aim at this whole
I love him.
Wealth gap arguments between races by pointing out if you classed it, the wealth gap doesn't entirely go away, but it mostly goes away. Mm-hmm. This is literally an elite versus a much more established elite fight. But beyond even that, one of the things that I remember of coming up, I think it was on Regrettable Century, but I checked it, and I never hear anyone talk about this. That even the non-union worker in the North that was black actually had, on average, higher purchasing power income than white workers in the South because of the way racial tensions could be used to break every single, and it worked. The South was never unionized at all. It pretty much dies in Upper Appalachia. Um, and it only gets into the mining industry even then, and it's crushed by the appearance of race. Now, what I find interesting about this is people somehow think, and more people now in 2020 amongst these millennials who like make me laugh about their like supposed, not, I mean, like younger millennials who are just coming up to me and like, I learned about sundown towns from Lovecraft Country, and I'm like, I learned about sundown towns because I am 40 years old, and even though that's not that old, that they were a living memory
Right.
when I was a kid. Where the fuck have you been? Like,
Right.
it's just like you're so removed from this context that you think this is ancient history, but the reason why they were such a useful thing is it was a way to, for elites in the South to, after Reconstruction is suppressed, to make sure that they remain, that the children of the planter elites that survived the war remained intact, and they had every cooperation from the Northeast to do so, because the South was also a source of cheap labor. The American textile industry, when it left New England, before it was outsourced, went to the South. And if you know anything about the way textile industries work, textile industry is what you put, the shittiest form of labor that you can allow in your economy is going to be in textile development. So, like,
another thing that's been true since the 1840s, incidentally.
Right. Earliest form of capital, shittiest form of capital. So,
no, there are theoretical consequences to this. So we've discussed how in individual political fights that this strategy is it's a tested and proved, time-honored strategy to break the working class's sense of solidarity with itself. There's also a theoretical component, which is all the anti-solidarity critical stuff. The idea that there is this, in my view, this is directly descended from actually late or middle late in your term, which I like, which a post-Horkheimer critical theory turn, which understood that, which thought, hey, you got a terrible problem here. Capitalism isn't going to break down. In fact, what capitalism will do is that it will complete itself as a gigantic bureaucratic state. And actually, capitalism's maybe already over because the bureaucratic state's already taking over. Just look at what happened in World War I. And then after World War II, they're just going to have to be these magic, megalopol, that's a terrible word, bureaucracies that will take over everything. So we really need
picking up of Hilferding, and that shows up in Horkheimer. Yeah. But
yeah, yes. Exactly. So, I mean, that leads to a whole series of call them critical theories of X. It doesn't matter what they are. But what they do is they take the model of capital, which is that there's a systematic behind the veil, right? Behind the veil of consciousness. So you'd have to do a little digging to see it. But behind the veil of society, that there's a system and that regulates, all of social relations, and that the material inequities arise on that basis. Okay, you take that framework and you just remove capital and put anything else in there. And it works. It's like it springs back to life like a zombie. So, you put race in there, and suddenly there's a structural racist paradigm that everyone is secretly operating under, and that accounts for inequities. You can just any colonization, you can put anything in there. So there's a theoretical consequence, which is that you get post-Marxism. Post-Marxism's in a very specific sense, which is that it's a replacement of a value theory with some other theory, non-materialist, almost always a kind of an idealist idea about a framework or a worldview which has taken over the minds of men. And then on the other side, you have a political consequence. So it's I'm only equipped to fight one at any time of day.
Yeah, this is the funny thing. I mean, I remember coming to this conclusion similarly from a similar debate that I had with Mark Fisher over the Vampire Castle essay, and I privately we mentioned standpoint epistemology's general idiocy, but I said, like, look, but your viewpoint of your British viewpoint of working class being determined by the worldview in which you made up is actually also a standpoint position. And let's go into the history of standpoint, because I wanted to believe that it was a liberal, post-Marxist, completely foreign deviation. I really did. And when I actually did the genealogy of it, it went straight back to Marxist feminism from a weird reading of Lukács.
The great generator of all revisionisms.
Right. But it was basically, your productive standpoint gives you an insight, an actual, not, and I was always like, one, there's no logical reason to believe that gives you any insight to anything but qualia. All right. Okay. Yeah. I can't deny your qualia. I can't deny anyone's qualia, by the way. Like, there's no meaningful way to deny someone's experience. Okay. But as far as like the actual structures of the world, it does not give you any insight to be subjected to those structures. In fact, from the standpoint of systems building, being in the structure, particularly in the mass of the structure, would be the least insightful place to be. So insight from an individual's perspective, from their social position, is not useful here, and thus there's no magical power by being working class or any other subcategory or intersectional category that you would use. Look at this. Yes, there are interesting things to learn if you do not take these demographics as somehow real, which I think most people, when they talk about social construction, want to have it both ways on this. So like when I talk about black struggles real because of the conditions of the way we came up with the idea of race as a part of a way to justify an economic category in the first place. Yes. It comes from material conditions. Something, by the way, that Abraham X. Kindy's book on critical race theory in history, not his anti-racist book, but his first one stamped from the beginning, totally accepts and admits, actually very well, talking about the relationship of whiteness and blackness that developed from the needs of proto-capitalist and after the Reconquista. And I'm like, it's a totally materialist explanation of race, which then is taken to non-materialist ends. But
there are any number of these materialist critiques going back decades and decades. It's even a kind of scholarly consensus outside the halls of the diversity committee at whatever bureaucratic institution you're at. This does bring us to a classical problem, which is the relationship of petty bourgeois intellectuals in the movement. I take it that there's no way around that. It's simply the same standpoint, right? Is there any magic in being a member of the working class? Well, no. In fact, it limits your ability to educate yourself about, let's say, the tendencies in history. And therefore, there will always be, in the Marxist movement, there's always going to be a problem with what you do with your petty bourgeois intellectuals, who are going to have material interests that don't completely align with every kind of wage worker. So every other kind of wage worker.
Right, but the idea of professional revolutionary is actually totally dependent on the idea of petty bourgeois intellectuals who just also happen to be professional revolutionaries. Like, that literally is the implication of the idea, is that the leadership of the socialist movement actually is people who have enough ability to be removed from work. That's why they're professional revolutionaries and not workers. Now, I will admit that this is the innovation of the Marxist humanist position, from Trotskyism, as they look at that and go, that doesn't make any damn sense from the standpoint of the advancement, the advanced sectors of the working class. But the problem with the advanced sectors of the working class thesis, the way it's been historically used, is I can make anything. So Marxist humanists from CLR James forward tend to make some oppressed minority or group the locust of attention. And so when people tell me this comes from the new left, I laugh. Right. This is where my study comes from.
Right. We hope that it had, but it turns out not to. It was us. We screwed up. Oops.
Yeah, the new left, actually, their focus on students was a logical extension of both the critical theory tradition and the tradition of the national question
put together.
Married together, which which is funny because it was actually an anarchist friend of mine who studies China, Alex Day, who pointed out that like the radical bourgeois project and the Marxist communist project is understood by the USSR and the CP and the PRC. Concurrently developed the same answers to the question, so you can't actually even tease out which frameworks were bourgeois and which frameworks came from a Marxist standpoint, because they developed concurrently and merged and interchanged language. And I was like that when I did that, and then I looked at this period of critical theory, which really just goes back to the 30s and 40s and the Otto Bauer question. You start realizing there's been no good answer for this the entire time, and our current received, like, I put this on this. I actually do. I do journalism on international affairs. It's the other mission of this channel, kind of. That and educating people on art so they're not morons.
We have to talk about art one of these days. I guess we did a little bit.
We will, but
I guess I'm technically a music historian, and you're technically a poet. So
I'm technically a poet with a background in anthropology.
Yeah.
So, like the idea that I got so everyone's always like, he's a historian. I'm like, no, actually I'm not. It's just I read a lot of books and history is easy to read. And apparently I do primary source stuff because I can kind of read German, but I didn't try to. I only started digging into German because I kept on being like, why don't I have an answer to this document? God damn it. Like,
how can I get a copy of X? Yeah. It's my whole life.
Yeah, I studied German to read Nietzsche and Hegel, and now I'm using it to like try to get a good copy of technical documents from the Second International. But anyway, that frustration aside, while I do think there's a sense in which I do think there's a sense in which what anti-imperialism is attempting to answer, and the theories which led J.A. Hobson, Luxemburg, and even and Bukharin to take it seriously. And you will notice I use Bukharin and not Lenin because I am not an anti-Leninist, but I think Lenin's answer to this problem was historically correct for about 10 years, and we have stuck to it way beyond it being correct, and that it's kind of just a popularization of the framework that Bukharin actually develops in more detail and better.
You'll have to tell me about that at some point, the Bukharin element. I haven't read enough Bukharin, but Rosa Luxemburg makes this point, the biggest danger of the Russian Revolution is that it'll become a model.
Right. So we get stuck with that nonsense in a lot of ways, even though, like, I actually think for the time period, Lenin's analysis does solve two problems in a very ingenious way that came out of the Second International, which both are legitimately found in Marx and Engels, which is the tendency towards monopoly capital on one hand and the declining rates of profits on the other.
Yep.
And his answer is more believable than Hobson's separately concurrently developed but overlaps with the socialist movement answer,
or with Hilferding's.
And Hobson and Hilferding actually rhyme. So Hobson's answer is we can just redistribute the profits and keep capital running indefinitely by redistributing it, getting rid of the surplus adjustment through properly adjusting consumption, and thus it's a homeostasis. Well, I should be careful because homeostasis sounds like I'm applying equilibrium theory, and this is before that, but it's a homeostatic.
I can barely spell that word.
Right. That's Hobson's answer. That's also kind of weirdly Rosa Luxemburg's sort of answer, because Luxemburg also comes up with a concurrently developed and separate from Hobson. She came on it on her own theory of underconsumptionism. Lenin gets us out of that, but people take that as one, that imperialism, which is actually the opposite of what Lenin says. Because Hobson held that imperialism is a natural development of capitalism, but is a different thing. That the capitalist oligarchs have turned to imperialism, and that is not actually
capitalism.
Not actually capitalism, but it is actually a logical result of capitalism. But it's a new third thing. Lenin says no, it isn't. What I find fascinating is actually post-Lenin, is the great Maoist innovation is to, flip the contradictions. So making imperialism the primary, most necessary contradiction, as if it is a separate thing from capital, even though they don't quite claim that. And so their answer actually goes back to Hobson's, which does have logical implications for stuff like why you can work with the non-comprador bourgeoisie over and over and over again in a popular front explicitly, and also somehow the nationalist bourgeoisie is less reactionary than the internationalist bourgeoisie for whatever reason that I don't understand.
I'm glad you brought up these political economic theories, because what I was going to say to you earlier was that the basic problem is that you get into all kinds of trouble once you give up on value theory.
Mm-hmm.
Once you give up on the idea that there's a historical trajectory and that whatever you think about a breakdown thesis, there is a historical endpoint to capitalist production, and that there has to be one. I mean, unless we're all headed to a meteor or death, which is totally still possible. But as long as you've given up on the value theory stuff, then it all falls apart. I take it that even the standpoint of the proletariat problem, which is that problem about how the petty bourgeoisie who are needed in order to merge, as in Lee's phrase, which I like a lot, the socialism with the labor movement. The socialism is not coming from the labor movement largely; it's coming from outside of it, from its more privileged strata. It seems to me that actually this problem is really simple, which is it's always going to be the case that workers are going to struggle against their employers. That's just a natural part of the system. And in order to have long-term gains, eventually there's a period of maturity, right? In order to have long-term gains, they need a political line. And after all their all the compromises, it turns out that an independent political line becomes necessary because no compromise can be made with the bourgeoisie without destroying the conditions for capitalist production. Like, there's no equilibrium you can get because business cycles are real, et cetera. Okay, and after that point, the independent political line has to have some kind of substance. And at the moment that has any kind of substance, you're going to get an ideology related to it, and they're going to be those who provide that ideology. Well, I've already, I haven't said very much except for things everyone in the Marxist framework would understand, and you already have more or less the solution to the problem here. Why is that the solution to the problem? Because what standpoint people are at is never a category in that description. It's just what the natural tendency would be of workers in a capitalist system, and what they eventually come to understand about the political line. And then it's as simple as that, maybe.
What I would say is, to me, the historical mistake of, say, Third International Marxism was to take breakdown being an inevitability of capital, something that Marx says in polemical writings, but is not implied even in Capital. But I actually want to take your point too. There's another point you subtly made there that I've made on my own. I had this long debate with Andrew Kleinman years ago when I accused him of being a immiseration theorist and said immiseration theory was wrong. And he said, no, I'm not, blah, 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 and had all these reasons. The reasons why he rejects breakdown theory. But then my response to him was, you are attributing a system as if there is no natural entropy in it. Like, you have basically made capitalism through crisis somehow, because you seem to posit that the crisis will always eat up the surplus production and capacity, which no, you have empirical evidence to the contrary twice in the last 40 years. That it's a self-perpetuating machine, that actually is sort of like a perfect social system that could theoretically go on forever. And I was like, no social system that I think socialism will be far more stable, frankly. But even socialism has to evolve and change, because otherwise it dies. Like, no social system overcomes the basic problems of entropy. So in some real way, you have to accept that, barring countervailing tendencies, of which there are tons, and there's probably more than Grossman or Marx knew. That's interesting. That's my critique. Like, there are more that emerge, which is why we were able to get to this point of capitalist decomposition in the first place. of which imperial profit seeking was one of many. All right. That's
and of
one.
course financial instruments, which
Financial.
don't. I mean, that complicates things, right? Because
Well,
it's
yeah.
not surplus value.
But then you get into like fun stuff of like, well, when you explain to people Marxist theory of value, unless you're a moron, is not Marxist theory of price.
No, it's not a
That,
theory of price at all.
like there is a relationship in aggregate from all prices to value. That relationship, some people might model one way, some people might like, I've heard more modern econophysicists who use statistics to say that's like an attractor to price, but it cannot said to be price because individuals can charge whatever the hell they want. It's just an aggregate that's going to wash out towards a number that would make sense from in the standpoint of capital profits being made, right? What people confuse, not only do they not understand the difference between income and wealth, which I think people are finally sort of getting. It's made itself into the bourgeois liberal discourse finally.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth Warren.
Right? All the and thank you, Peckety. Even though you clearly never read Marx, you lying piece of shit.
Not with any understanding. That's very funny.
Thank you. But all that said, there is a real sense that this is obscured the debate. People see capitalists with the biggest incomes that they've ever had in captive inequality in ways they've never seen. And I've asked you, but is it real? Is any of this fungible? Could you liquidate it? I'm going to do an explainer video on why cryptocurrency is not a currency.
Oh, really? I would love. I'd love to know what your thoughts are. Cryptocurrency scares living daylights out of me. I got to tell you.
It makes perfect sense as an investment instrument in a place for all the reasons you say. You have extra money, you got to put it somewhere. It grows faster than inflation. However, when people have told me, well, this is like the modern version of metalism. Metalism, there's not enough metal, so we're going to move to a specifically designed deflationary symbol, and it's specifically defined to be deflationary. There would be less and less of it found over time by its own algorithm processes, and it takes more and more energy to get. All right, that was actually designed to mimic metalism. That's how it was designed. The people who designed it were like gold bugs. That's what they were doing. However,
how terrifying. You haven't solved the terrifying problem for me.
No, this is totally terrifying. But let me tell you why it can't be a currency. People talk about it as a currency.
Okay.
On a regulated market, things are not priced in cryptocurrency because it is too deflationary. Everyone knows that the value would be too much in flux. So while they will take it as a form of payment, it is still priced in government money or some other commodity. This is even more true of the fact that cryptocurrencies are not monopolized and thus compete against each other. So there are three, whether or not you're a Marxist, a modern classical economist, or an MMTer, they change one of these functions, but there are three functions of money. Cryptocurrency only does two of them.
Because it's not a store of value?
It is a store of value, and it is.
Oh, you're saying it's not a means of payment?
It is a means of payment.
Sorry, I got in the two ones that it is.
It's not a means of pricing.
Oh, I see.
It's not a standardization. You need a new standardization to formalize the relationship. Cryptocurrency is too deflationary for that.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Like, yeah. It's hyper deflationary, which is people think that's a good, but that only makes it a seeming investment mechanism. And this is where it's different from metalism. It's totally dependent on the larger social production staying static, because if the governments fail, the power grids fail. And if the power grids fail, the internet fails. And if the internet fails, all this blockchain shit no longer means a goddamn thing. This is not real fungible capital. It has no commodity basis, and thus doesn't meet all the functions of money. It only makes two of them. You can use it as a means of exchange, but not priced in itself. And you can use it as an investment mechanism, as a store of value, but you cannot really use it you can't use it as the price setting to pay all goods and debts. There's no way to do that. And so it doesn't meet every function. Now, this is a logical extension of a capitalist economy that has declined so much that the only profit sources are fictitious capital rent seekings and IPs.
Right, which is profit for one and loss for another. And
Right.
for that reason, the cryptocurrencies are symptomatic in my view.
Yeah.
In fact, when I get into discussions about this with people I'm unfortunate enough to get in discussions with about this, usually young men, incidentally.
Yeah, even I get socialist young men who buy into cryptocurrency, which blows my mind.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
did you fail Marxism 101? Like on the basic level, because this is not like the debates over modern monetary theory versus gold theory, which like there are legitimate debates to be had there. All right. And also Marx is on both sides of that debate, depending on what you cite when and how you interpret it. But there's no way that you can look at the accepted, you know, the classical and neoclassical function of money. Ironically, even in neoclassical economics, which exists pretty much to give the middle finger to Marxism by inventing new categories. That's literally kind of what it exists for.
That's right. Yeah, in order to avoid classical political economy, which ends in Marx.
Right. The definition of money that everybody uses, but MMTers, and they just change one thing. Okay, is Marx's.
Yeah.
It's Marx's.
Well, I mean, here's the problem. Money isn't value.
No, not at all.
Value. And you know, if you're Marxist, then you don't care about money. You care about value.
If money was value, inflation wouldn't be a thing.
That's right. I mean, look, if it turns out to be money, then if it turns out to be money, then it has value. And if it has value, then that's some control over social labor. And you know, all the other puzzles are out of the question. It's the solution to nothing, which is why in fact, I was going to say that when I get into discussions about this, with this as an investment, right? Is this a good investment? And the answer for anyone listening, the answer is no. This is a terrible investment. It's awful. NFTs are worse. Actually, I just saw that you can literally buy an NFT for the Brooklyn Bridge, which is poetry, I guess. But no, you know, they'll at some point, you know, get into this argument, and then they'll say to me, "Well, what else? What else would you have me do?" You know, I can't invest in property. I can't invest as, you know, capital in productive, you know, in any kind of productive industry. What am I supposed to do other than gamble? And, you know, I mean, of course, the answer is to join a revolutionary organization. But yeah, I mean, that's where it's coming from, right? Desperation. And I take it that that's just so good. Thank God. I mean, you know, yeah, NFTs, put your money there.
But this is where I am like hitting a wall with people. I mean, yes, with the monetary people are different, and we're not talking about them. But
yeah, they're totally different. They also don't think value is real, but they have different.
They think value and liquidity are basically the same thing. They will say they don't, but that is the logical implication of their theory.
I don't. Stephanie Kelton does not know what value is.
But all that aside, looking at this problem, when you meet socialists who are telling you there is no evidence for declining rates of I'm like, look, okay, in real commodities, and I know real commodities here are not defined in the Marxist way, it's defined in a very limited, narrow way, but in real commodities, the declining rates of profits is universally accepted even amongst neoclassical economists, and there is empirical evidence for it that people have marked out. You don't believe me? Oil. Done. Walk away. Like why is a commodity that is scarce and super important to all production still declining in fucking value?
Right. Yeah, it's a special one. I mean, yeah, you know, you go back to the 1860s and a bicycle is worth, you know, 3 months of an average workman's salary, you know, and it's not now. Obviously, products decline in value over time as production technology gets more efficient. That much everyone agrees on. But what kind of empirical, you know, you wanted to declining their profit does not mean whether rich people get richer. That's just not.
Yeah, it's not what we're talking about at all. In fact, one of the implications actually of declining rates of profits would be that there is more reasons for the rich to hoard their wealth because there's nothing for it to for them to invest in to
There's a
outpace
savings
inflation.
problem. The big crisis in today's global economy is a savings problem, which comes to the same point, which is, it's the profitability crisis. That is, can I put my money into into something profitable, into building things that people need? That's what capitalism survives, is because it's the mode of production under which the production for the goods and services that we all need to live normally, is carried out. Those are the social relations in which that production is carried out. It doesn't mean anything about incomes or any
income inequality is kind of irrelevant to that.
So
in fact, Marx says so.
Okay. So now I have a question for you, which is, all right, say I'm right and capitalism is 10 years dead.
Mm-hmm.
Then what happens when they try to raise interest rates again?
Everything fucking falls apart.
Yeah. See,
and I think everybody. Here's the thing. Everybody kind of knows it.
Yeah.
This is where the most unserious people about this are actually Marxists. I'm hearing fucking Nate Silver talk about this problem. Like, well, if they raise interest rates, we'll have a recession. That's just. But if they don't raise interest rates, they're even politically doomed because inflation flips everybody out and really does, despite what some people tell you, hurt the poor.
Sure, of course it does. Of course it does. Oh, but I want your listeners to remark that Varn listens to 538 podcast. Apparently, everyone.
Yes, I do. I actually told someone the other day. I listened to 5 Marxist podcasts. Everything else I listen to is standard bourgeois stuff.
Oh yeah, I listen to Pod Save America, man. I smoke
let's
before
talk
doing
about,
it. But
yeah, I mean, like you want to talk about making me angry, but when I get the glosses from Vox, yeah, I want to stab someone. But or when I get the glosses from the Wall Street Journal from the right, I want to stab someone. But I also am aware that I'm getting bullshit from left media a lot of the time. Like, let's be honest. It's like, it's subpar shit. I remember this was one of the real awakenings of how fucked we were in the Bernie moment. I'm going to tell you about this. I was listening to someone who did realize a theory that I've been floating, and I floated this to Esri. It's going to come out as a supplement on Mortal Science probably in like a year, because we release shit really slow. I recorded this last year, and I said my pet theory was the reason why we have never fixed profitability in medicine is that the moment we did, 30% of all viable middle income jobs go away. And I'm like, because this doesn't work like a capitalist. What do you mean? I'm like, I've lived in places that have socialized medicine, and I've lived in places where there are no insurance. Believe it or not, they work relatively similarly against the U.S. Like, so I go to a hospital in Egypt. Prices are posted. Right?
Wow, that's unbelievable today.
They work like a normal fucking market. In the U.S., it's not possible. There's total price opacity, and part of that is, and there's all this expansion of administrative fiat. There is cost disease in education and medicine,
and they're also the most weighed down by administration.
Right. And so, what would you do if you socialized it? Well, if you socialize it and say the government's going to save money, which is the argument you've made, and they would, the reason how they save money is getting rid of that cost disease. Now, what's that going to get rid of that cost disease? It's not just the profits for the pharmaceutical companies. Yes, there's that.
It's also labor costs.
You're going to cut all this additional labor costs, and then so there was one person in the Bernie campaign that admitted this. Okay.
I missed this moment. Cool.
Yeah, no, I was listening to the dig, and he's like, so what we're going to do is use a jobs guarantee to turn all these people into a concierge service for better service. And I was like, what? Like you think that that even a social society, but a capitalist society is going to tolerate a universal concierge service so we don't get rid of all these jobs? Or you think that we're going to be able to reskill these people over fucking night to get them into the Green New Deal? Are you a moron? Like, have you ever studied logistics for once in your life? Like, but that's when I knew. I mean, I kind of knew it anyway, but that's when I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, none of this was serious. Like, I was like, you haven't thought it through. You haven't remotely thought about what this means.
Oh, thank God Bernie didn't win. I know that's a terrible, terrible thing to say, probably for a lot of your listeners. I would have hated to have to make this argument with Bernie as president.
I mean, luckily, what would happen with Bernie as president is probably not that different than what happens Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party, which that his party sabotages him to shit. Even the beloved Squad.
You're probably right about that too. There are all kinds of this counterfactual is very fun, and we should write a novel about it one day.
Yeah, it is like how many ways? Like I have 13 ways where Bernieism would have discredited socialism for a generation if it had one.
Oh yeah, Millerandism on steroids, man. And it's worse because it's not even social democracy. It's democratic socialism, which is the far right wing of social democracy. It's the saddest thing I've ever heard. No, but you're right. I think that we're hitting this weird moment where it's, I even see investor types say this, lots of, what's the guy's name that
I think this is a difference between serious people and people whose economics is a form of their moral identity.
Yeah, it is.
Is like serious people are realizing first they thought the problem was automation. The automation was going to lead to this. This was 10 years ago. I can't say who, and I swear to people I'm not making this up. I had a friend of mine who is a contractor for the intelligence services tell me obliquely that
you have extensive social circles.
I do.
I don't have that many friends, man. Go on.
When you move through different countries, you have to make friends with a lot of different kinds of people, which by the way, if people were good Leninists, they would do, because Lenin explicitly says to do that. But people aren't really good Leninists in any meaningful sense. But beyond that, he said to me they were really worried about automation. Like as government competence, like the military was really worried about automation. Well, they realized kind of what Aaron Benyanev realized in working automation, that no, they aren't going to automate everything down to nothing, because eventually there'll be no profits. They have to have somebody in the workforce.
Yeah, that's right. There's got to be someone. Oops. Yeah, it turns out in order to run a capitalist economy, what the capitalist economy has been regulating is labor. It hasn't been regulating the distribution of goods. It certainly hasn't been regulating what goods we need to produce, right? It doesn't do that at all. And in fact, most people are, as I said before about bullshit jobs, there's huge needs in society that society doesn't meet at all. And then there are needs that no one needs. I think it's what's that guy who has that wonderful series? He was a Habermasian or something, but he's on that great courses. He's like from West Texas and talks about Hegel. Anyway,
Rick Roderick.
Where at some point he says, there never was a social movement to demand the hula hoop. And it's like, right, okay, right. We don't produce what we need, right? Obviously, no. So what is it regulating? What is capitalism regulating? Well, no, I mean it's what's regulating is labor, and so obviously if you don't, it can't just regulate the machines. This is why the Matrix nightmare is wrong. The Matrix world is a profit world. It's not the apotheosis of capitalism. It's its negation. It's some completely different alien system.
Yeah. This is also why Dick Land is wrong. But like.
Someone I've never read, and you're not going to make me.
No, you don't need to. But it's why right wing accelerationism doesn't actually, like, I'm not super worried about it, because it's like it's literally not viable. Just like I say when people go at me about, well, what about right wing modern monetary theory, right wing Keynesianism? I'm like, one, right wing Keynesianism was actually kind of the policy of part of the fascist anyway.
It's also what we're doing right now. Yeah, what do you call QE other than right-wing Keynesianism?
Yeah, and by the way, my other not unpopular, but people don't understand what I mean when I've said, look, all this inflation isn't from the middly pit. You think piddly social policies like $300 a month in tax credit for a year is going to cause this amount of inflation? You are a fool. What is causing this amount of inflation is that we've been asset inflating capital for 10 years to make it seem like there was any profitability left, just by pumping in no interest loans, or negative interest loans effectively when you factor inflation into the system. Now we had something finally cause a bottleneck, just like it had in the Keynesian period. It took an external shock. Now you can do the thing that I hear the post-Keynesians and a lot of the socialist left do, is pretend that that was politically determined policy thing, that they could have just maintained Keynesianism and, inflation would have. No, that probably wouldn't have happened. And right now, similarly, inflation is happening because that QE got bottled up in COVID and is now, and also there are continuing factors. The reason why it's not even is supply chain issues, but it's not going away because that QE's got to go somewhere. People are not comfortable. People realize if the stock market always goes up, no matter what happens, that it's fictitious investment and that it might not be liquid. People aren't stupid. Like, so you have increased hedging of bets into the buying of property, forming property associations to seek rents, things that capitalism historically actually fought against. And this is why some of the most reactionary elements of capitalism always distrusted finance capital, because part of finance capital has a relationship to pre-capitalist rents.
Oh yeah, it's parasitic. It absolutely is parasitic, and a tried and true capitalist shouldn't be interested in speculative bubbles.
Right.
Like there's nothing more horrifying than a crypto billionaire. It's like that's definitely just stolen money. Washed you from the system.
Are all these tech billionaires who have run things that are only profitable by either absurd venture capital, again looking for profits because there aren't any, or government, or literally in the case of Amazon and Musk, direct government support until profitability was had against competition up to and including decades. So, like,
Precisely.
You can't tell me that what you're seeing is like classically understood capitalism. And ironically, the only people who get this outside of Marxist are the most doctrinaire libertarians, and they've mostly gone away.
Yeah, I don't hear a lot of that anymore. I don't hear a lot of libertarianism anymore. I mean, obviously the right has other concerns. Many of them have to do with culture, which is cool. Yeah, let them do that. I think that's great. Let them do that.
Fight over the epiphenomena. That's fine.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know about Jesus.
I do think some of what culture describes is important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, like,
we'll have that fight on some other time.
Well, I mean, social reproduction matters, and the thing is, culture is a metaphor which includes social reproduction sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's true. We should specify what we're talking about.
Right, but that's the problem with culture. Is it's a fucking like. I say this as a person studying anthropology. I rejected cultural anthropology precisely because when I was an undergrad, and I was not a leftist yet. This is not a leftist thought. I was like, I can't define what culture is. I can't find a definition of culture that makes sense. Like,
it's literally a metaphor. It's an agricultural metaphor, incidentally.
Right. Like it's one of these biological. It's like memes, which was another stupid metaphor that for a while had a life of its own that people pretended were scientific. And
they're just like genes, Varn. They're just like genes.
Yes, ideas are like genes.
Yeah,
they infest like genes, and I'm like, what's the physical transmission mechanism, buddy? Like,
what the hell?
This is some weird idealist shit. But to get back on topic, and I've been ranting, and so have you. This brings us back to Kautsky and the Kautsky moment. So we've said that what this is an orientation towards the past, because the present is a breakdown. Yes. Here's the rhyme with Grossman. Grossman predicted the total breakdown of capital by the 1930s, and people are like, oh well, he was wrong, and I will say he was wrong, but his theory was not disproven by what happened. What happened was you had a massive
devaluation of capital,
which massively devalued and destroyed production on a level that the human race had not seen at one time priorly.
Yeah, sucked.
Yeah, and I've told people who want to think about this. So I was like, okay, you have this overproduction now. What would it take to get rid of it?
Right.
If it took World War II to get rid of the overproduction of the Long Depression, World War I and World War II, actually, you should take them together. To get rid of the overproduction of the Long Depression. What the hell would get rid of the Armageddon's about it? Like, humans don't survive the correction of this.
And
Like,
I don't see the global tendencies going that direction.
me neither. I just
I don't
don't.
fear a war. I know that's another unpopular opinion. I just don't fear a war. You know, I don't fear a war with China. I don't think we're bombing China for the same reason we didn't bomb Michigan during World War II. We're not going to bomb the industrial center of the world. You know, that just seems nuts. So if we're running out of war, as Garl Perowitz said that, I think, if we're running out of war in that way, then yeah, what's left? And of course, if we're right, and they are going to screw this up. I just think they're going to screw this up. I think they're going to get really freaked by inflation and then try to rein it in. They're going to try to Evergrande their way out of the problem with like this kind of managed devaluation of capital sort of thing, except without the talent or bureaucratic, efficiency of the Chinese. They're going to do that, but worse. I mean, the jury's still out, by the way, on Evergrande. Who knows what's going to happen? No one's ever tried it.
I'm about to say, like, what they're trying to do has never been done. And
in the history of the human race, no one has ever tried to deleverage like that in the history of the human race. And I'm watching them just like with popcorn, just like let's see what happens with this.
What's funny is in the West, and this is where people having global knowledge really helps them. In the West, we think that China's like a super economy because they've been outproducing, they're at a higher
growth rates,
right? Mm-hmm. In Africa, they've been talking about how China's economy is crashing.
Sure. And Latin America,
how China's economy, because they can't, even though China's doing a lot for Africa, there's a lot of complicated. I did a whole episode on this, but that's the way they view it, and I'm like, that's because the relative expectation of growth rates is like massively different between the developed and developing worlds, and then actually it's the developed worlds where growth rates are the lowest, which, if you believe in declining rates of profit, is perfectly consistent.
And it's global. The beautiful thing is global, and I think I've heard you make this point elsewhere, which is that this is clearly everyone's going through the same thing, and we're doing it under different conditions, but we're going through the same thing because now capital is truly, even more global than it was before, and so we have you can call it many different things, but let's call it the deleveraging problem. We're going to have to deleverage. And I don't think that's going to be pretty. Of course, that puts some pressure on a revolutionary strategy.
Particularly that plus climate change together is a 1-2 whop.
Oh, it's great. Conditions couldn't be better. I mean, honestly, if what you want is the end of capitalism, then conditions look great.
Yeah, conditions look great for the end of capitalism, but they don't necessarily look great for socialism.
Except for who knows what the conditions for socialism are, because every socialist revolution has ended in capitalism. So
that's also fair. But this is what I'm always arguing with liberals, and like, well, what would you use as your historical model? And I'm like, okay, I want you to really grasp what you're asking of me, because you are asking, say, the merchant who says we need to end feudalism, what capitalism would look like from the standpoint of the 11th century. Even though there are elements of capitalism all the way back to late antiquity, clearly, but there's no fully instantiated capitalism. Okay, just we all pretty much agree on that, except for capitalists who like to see any market that ever happened anywhere as proof of capitalism, even though there's no profits and whatever. So ask yourself, how would we answer that question? And you would go, you couldn't. And I'm like, yeah, what we're talking about, we do have a positive program for this, which is better than anybody else had actually but you're asking us to define the conditions of a world that does not exist yet. And to find a clear analog for it in the world that does. Now we can talk about the USSR is super instructive for a lot of things. One is how not to overcome capitalism.
Right, negative as a negative thesis. Yeah, right. A negative example.
And then the other one is, the other thing that, I had someone on the other week talking about imperialism, and they're like, well, what about when China finally cuts off foreign investments? And I'm like, okay, so yes, China has capital investment controls. China controls things on a level that no other capitalist society has ever done. I'm not arguing with you. But do you really think it can have no profits and operate the kind of productive economy that it operates? And where did those profits come from? And then they're like, and are they going to do it? Like, So they're just going to have a voluntary block of the world that's just going to merge their economies with them willy-nilly, even though there's been no effort built to that, even in like China and Africa or anything like that, since the death of Mao. Do you think that's what's going to happen? Do you seriously think that literally the locus of world capitalist production now is somehow going to be able to just flip a switch by state fiat when the developmental conditions are magically right and undo that in the world system, and that the world system would let them?
Yeah,
Like,
no. This is unpardonably dense. But maybe the question isn't what your model is. I mean, I take that to be a blackmail sort of question anyway, and it's always secretly about the Soviet Union, and even when it's not.
It was like,
but maybe the question is, what ought socialists to be doing in the present? What can you go out your door and do? And I take it that there is something to do. So the thing we need very badly is an independent political line for workers. And that is not entirely unpopular or totally out of the realm of possibility. And I think that in every single workplace and in every single residence, actually, I feel strongly that as we become majority renters, one of the things we're gonna have to do is take over our living situations that have become communal because they've been concentrated in that way. Every renter, every worker needs to form organizations and learn how to do that. Learn the everyday practice of democracy and self-government. I take it that look, I'm not a
joining a
Rick Wolf
union
acolyte.
is more important than joining DSA, as I have said many times.
Yeah,
but one thing I will say,
corrupt union.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All unions are corrupt.
Right.
But what I will say, and people are always baffled by that when I'm like, you sound like this utter left come about unions. I'm like, yeah, because I'm in one.
Yeah.
Like, because I'm in one, I completely understand what the struggle internal to the union is.
Be a dissident in your union.
The union, that's your locus of struggle, really.
Yeah.
The one thing I push back on that a little bit is that we also have to rebuild the workers' movement.
I agree entirely.
Almost
with that.
From scratch.
That's the other thing that makes it a lot like the 1890s, man. To bring us full circle, guess what they were doing? Building the workers' movement from scratch.
From scratch, yes. And we have different conditions to do it under. And I am at a spaghetti against the wall where I'm like, okay, try your mutual aid shit. Make it sure it's actually mutual aid and it's not just charity, but try it. Fine. Do your dual power strategy. Join whatever kind of weird union you're going to join. Fuck, I don't care. You can join DSA. I'm going to make fun of you for it. I think it's a waste of time, but it is an idea. Maybe you can do something with it. There are actual workers there. They're very sectional and limited to certain parts of the country, but whatever. And do it critically. And this is the other thing. When we say the ruthless critique of everything that exists, we join these organizations under the auspices that we are loyal to our class and our politics, not the organization.
Right. Yes. And loyal to our historical mission.
Right.
And, I don't think joining the DSA is particularly silly. I mean, why is a party necessary? A party is necessary because in order to win real gains, the various workers movement or various workers organizations, which are separate from one another, whether it be co-ops or unions, are going to have to coordinate their activities in order to win. And there needs to be kind of a clearinghouse for struggle. And that just happens to be called the party. The party is a function, a necessary function of the workers movement. Now, it can be co-opted and transformed into a wing of the Democratic Party, and like lots of things can happen to it. But that there is a party in function is that there's a party in embryo in history is my point, and a role that it plays. And as long as we're focused on that, I think we'll be okay in the end because I'm an optimist. Varn, I'm an optimist.
Yeah, and I'm not. But
good. Finally, something we disagree on.
I have the arch revolutionary. This has come up. I have the arch revolutionary pessimist.
Everything's gonna be okay. I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Yeah. Well, I'm like, everything will be awful, but we might have socialism at the end of it. Maybe if you're really on your shit. I do think that's. But what I find fascinating is that people don't like that for a variety of reasons, even though they say they do it. And the reason why they don't like it, one, sectarian organizations and activist organizations have shared one key trait since the decline of the Third International, whether we like it or not, And so, however much I want to bitch about Stalinism, after the Third International, what filled in the gap was activists, and activists were largely based off students who had the leisure time but the desperation to participate in the moral calling. So this was the reason why this was seen actually as a possible revolutionary class in the left wasn't totally stupid the way it seems to us now, because it was a disaffected, rapidly expanding, large parts of which were formerly of the working class and background. After the GI Bill, going into education, but not necessarily having clear jobs, although they had way more than they thought, frankly.
Oh, being downwardly mobile, at least in their own eyes, and that's
right.
That's of course the most radicalizing thing.
Right. So that was the idea. Now that got dropped, but the reason why activists, NGOs, and sectarian organizations got addicted to students as organizations, from a standpoint of the organization, is they have a lot of fucking time and leisure to give it,
and the classroom discipline of servility.
Right. And they're used to being bossed around, and while they think they're rebelling, they're actually not. So like if you thought the social movement was the embryo of the revolutionary class, it was from that scenario, but it has led to a dependence on moralistic involvement of identity, and of concepts like justice, leading to largely people who have the leisure to do so. And when people are like, well, there's all these people of color and formal working, I'm like, what was their class background? Don't look at the aggregate, look at the specific person.
What did they do for a living, or what did they do, or what they hoped to do for a living?
What did they do, and how did they get into Harvard?
The worst thing is you see these. I mean, we're talking about decolonial theory. All of it's like PhDs in education or something, which is this like the bizarre corner of the academic world where you can do anything, and of course everything you do is for your own self-advancement in the first place. No, but speaking of optimism, maybe this is the concluding point. I mean, this is no longer going to be cool anymore. It'll not be cool because the situation is going to hit the fan, for reasons we've already stated.
It's already clear. COVID has made it clear more than anything else that it is hitting the fan. That this isn't going to get fixed today or tomorrow. And even if the pandemic gets under control, normal is dead.
That's right.
Like, it's dead. There's like, you can't. We had 10 years of bullshitting ourselves and thinking that maybe there wasn't that 2008 was just a blip, and it was just a really deep. And then I'm like, well, you didn't have a massive world war because, by the way, nukes make that too costly. So what do you got? Like, actually, the development of the last fix of capital accumulation has made it happening again an existential threat to all of humanity, and we're not stupid, not in that way,
not self-destructive in that way. No. That's just true. So for that reason, it's going to become less and less cool to talk about bullshit issues, distracting issues, because conditions will become more and more pressing. And a lot of those people who felt themselves to be downwardly mobile and radicalized on the basis of something other than the workers' movement, will find themselves further downwardly mobile and out of rational contact with their own, or at least rational intuition about their own material self-interest, will become the formerly petty bourgeois, theoretical base of a workers' movement. Everything is going according to plan, Varn, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
History's going in the right direction and everything's fine.
So my, I really do think the key of our disagreement has now been exposed, is that we agree on 90% of things. You are an optimist about what they mean, and I am a short run pessimist who thinks, well, optimism may be possible after half of us are dead. But
I'll give a beautiful oration at your funeral. Don't worry.
So when I look at the current situation, I mean, it's hard not. It sometimes feels like in a real sense. So when I'm talking to socialists, I'm talking to people who are in active denial of reality, but not in the denial of the reality that liberals are saying they're in denial of. And like liberals are so far gone. Like it's just like, oh, it's moral values and geopolitical strategy. What's the geopolitical strategy for, dipshit? Like, what do you think this is all for?
I don't know. Something
like,
about mansion. I couldn't pay attention.
I mean, like it's just the other good thing. This is a point of optimism. People thought I was being pessimistic about the other day, and I was like, hey, you know all those shitty millennial hangers-on fail sons? A lot of them bought property now because they finally got their parents' wealth because their parents either got scared and finally divulged it to them because they were scared of the economic conditions post-COVID, or they died because of COVID. So are something second order from COVID, like cancer being harder to treat or something like that. And you know, I've seen this in my own life where people who are just slightly younger than me are all of a sudden finally getting those inheritances that everyone else. But what I'm saying is good about that is this is not going to affect most millennials. It's not. There's not enough inherited. Like most, that's such a declining pool. But what it is going to do is a lot of the bullshit that we have from hangers on. They're going to have property and they're going to be clearly the enemy soon. So
wait, or what do you think is going to happen to property values when the next market crash comes along?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually.
So all of that inheritance, what's it good for?
Well, if they don't continuously pump QE into things, which means constantly risking inflation.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the great question, and maybe we'll come back to talk about that at some point.
Yeah, because that's what I don't know. Because like it's politically destabilized. Like
I don't know what they're gonna do.
Like oh, we're gonna have this anti-democrat. Like oh yeah, well if they don't deliver inflation, if they don't stop inflation, which by the way, as far as the QE policies and whatnot, they're identical.
Yeah.
What's gonna happen? Well, they're not gonna have a mass base. Yes, the ideological fervor can last. It can survive. It can outsurvive Trump even, but it won't outsurvive it for very long. This was the whole fear of Nazism was what was interesting because Trotsky would always say Nazism was inviable because it was a fundamentally unstable class coalition and ironically, even though I think the right oppositionists actually were more right about the conditions of Nazism in the short run, Trotsky ultimately was right. It was inviable. That's why the Allies were able to destroy it. Like, if it was viable, it would have survived the fucking war. So, like,
I mean, a lot of loss. We gotta acknowledge that.
Yeah, but I mean,
but you're right. That's right. But turns out fascism also leads back to capitalism.
Right. Like so because
great flaw.
So it doesn't form a new. So with this too, like you don't want it to happen because it could be a world historic crisis in the interim, and millions of people could die. I don't know that I see that, but millions of people could die. But the issue is not that we're going to be under, you know, the long durée of the Trump-inspired Diocletian Empire.
No.
Not what's going to happen.
The fear that one-dimensional man will come because there'll just be profit forever and ever and ever is clearly not.
Oh my God! You want to talk about a time that feels, you know,
remote.
Remote. Go back and read all that 50 socialist stuff. The only thing that feels remotely relevant to now was to talk about the expansion of administrative and managerial classes. But every other thing they said and what they based that on, and I've pointed out to a friend of mine who's always talking about the PMC and how I don't take it seriously enough.
Oh God. I hate that category. Go on.
Yeah, but because it's a fundamentally incoherent category.
Doesn't make any sense.
Like it's not even James Burnham's category. But anyway, all that aside, what are these people going to survive on? Like how what could they possibly do? Because the projections that I saw, for be they Burnham, be they Pollock, be they right or left, were infinite profits in either educational, administrative, or military bureaucratic elites being able to be supported by those infinite profits indefinitely. Now, I don't know about you, but it does seem that even though the military is the most popular institution in the United States, that almost everybody kind of does realize that the military budget is a massive drain on everything.
Yeah. Not that it could go away without incurring the. Well, nothing could go away. Everything's in breakdown. But yeah,
right, yeah, but not just to not go away, but like as I've pointed out to people, hey, even the military doesn't want this imperialism anymore. They don't think it's viable. Why are we still funding them at like it is? And like everyone goes to pivot the age. I'm like, but no one actually thinks China and the United States are going to war. Listen to what they say. They don't really believe that. What this really is we all kind of know the only thing holding our stupid fiat money together is gunpowder. Like it's holding, it's buoying the currency. That's why we're doing it.
And only for the moment. We might not even be successful in maintaining that. The United States is pretty badly run.
The only reason we're still the reserve currency of the world is inertia and the fact that China doesn't float its currency.
And doesn't want to be the reserve currency of the world, which is the reason why it has the monetary policy that it does. It just doesn't see that in its short-term interests. I mean, for us, I guess. But
and every now and then they kind of flirt with it, but then they couldn't use us as a dumping ground for their own overproduction. So so where are you at? I mean,
right.
You're in a system where, I mean, I guess it would be really, my final point on this is it would be really nice to believe that Bernie or Conrad G or anybody was going to be able to just step into the void and save us from these historical forces, which is why everybody is looking towards it right now. This is why so many people are crypto Bonapartists. Again, also relevant to the time period that we're
crypto Bonapartists. I like that. I'm taking that from you.
Like they won't admit that they're Bonapartists, but they really just kind of want progressive Bonapartism. Like they all thought that Bernie was going to be able to get stuff through executive order, which I was like, man, you're ignorant about how the American government actually works. But you can't use executive functions for that with non-emergency time. But regardless, I do think neo-Kautskyism, to tie this back down and in here, is the way we should look, if only because it is the rhyming period to what we're seeing right now. It is not the same. We do not have the same material conditions. We're not in the same places. The United States was in a very different position of world capital during this time point. It was not yet the empire that it is now, although it was becoming it, but it was not yet the empire it is now, etc. and so forth. But that transition's there. Now, I want to tell people who think that like China is going to get us out of this they thought America was going to get us out of this too at different points.
Yeah, that's true.
And through Keynesian policy, through the Keynesian internationalism, through being the most advanced form of neoliberalism, even more advanced than its locus in Anglophone Europe. It's been, we did not last as long as the British, and if these trends continue, China's management may get us as long as us, but like we got what, 2.5 generations? Like it's actually pathetically small.
And our accumulation happened largely independently of the British Empire, whereas China's accumulation does not happen independently of us, the United States. So
no,
our fates are tied. That's why we're going through two different versions of the same transition. The transition is out of capitalism into what? I don't know, but I've decided to take a Valium about it.
Well, I mean, yeah, you have, and I am like freaking out. But the one thing I will say is like this year was the first year I had a hopes of a workers' movement, and in my life.
Me too.
Like all other times, I'm like, they're not like nothing. Not even the first year of COVID. I'm like, if this doesn't do it, nothing's gonna fucking do it.
No, and man, I mean, I'm in the UC system. We just had a really successful strike threat run by a bunch of people who I know and like, and I think are smart. This year, I was able to. We passed rent control in Santa Ana, or I live in Santa Ana, California, and we passed rent control, and then the landlord tried to screw us over it, and then suddenly I was holding tenants meetings. Why? Because everyone wants someone to knock on their door and say, "Hey, isn't this bullshit?" And that condition That basic condition is, I don't know, that's what's giving me hope. It's not like people are resistant to organization.
They're really not.
They're ready. They're ready to move. And I think that's what our job is. And plus, never has Marxist self-education been easier. The last 2.5 hours we spent together are that. Podcast I'm working on is that. You do a whole bunch of stuff like that. It's never been easier to do this. And we've never had access to more stuff. We have all 4 volumes of Capital, after all. How could we go wrong?
We actually are beginning to get most of the history of the socialist movement available in each other's languages.
Hey, only took 100 years.
Yeah, despite, I don't know, a couple of mega states that supposedly were interested in that.
Right, yeah, that's right. Yeah, staffed with manifestly brilliant men like Ryazanov.
Right.
Yeah. Terrible.
And we neglected to translate all the important shit, or even collect it all in one spot. Like,
I know. Holy hell.
So yeah, I mean, we are in this renaissance. I would say that where I totally agree with you is this workers stuff is where the hope and future is. Hoping that the politicization towards the Democratic Party and then flipping it that way seems to me to be a fool's errand without this other stuff being done. And the reason why I say that is because while this is happening and people are screaming for organization, they really are. They will never trust politicians anymore. And this current administration is, is good enough reason as the last 50 as to why. Because when people talk to me about, well, why don't people vote for Democrats? They're voting against their interests. I'm like, when has the Democrats ever passed their agenda, even when they had a fucking supermajority? They don't.
Yeah, also interests, really?
Right. So that's their interest. That's really their interest.
Those are their material interests. I love that. They often say, historians will often say, well, because it didn't result in more income for them, that was outside the context of their economic interests, and therefore economics doesn't rule in history. These straw man ideas of what an economic interpretation of history must be. Yeah, no, obviously that's extraordinarily silly. We're at the beginning of something. I think there's lots of reasons for cynicism, but not as many as I thought they would be. And, you can talk all day about how small and probably meaningless the Starbucks unionization is.
I actually haven't talked any shit about it. I haven't talked about graduate.
Even Jane McAlevy's talked shit about that one, man. I mean, but I believe that it's important, if only because you want to look at, Generation Z, which is staring climate change in the face, and give them a story that isn't, don't be an asshole.
Right. Don't be an asshole and die with dignity is what we've basically been telling them for 20 years. And lastly, the reason why Starbucks, Burger Bill, which is a bigger problem, and I do make fun of that one, but they're also proving the viability of being able to unionize franchise shops, which has been a fucking nightmare.
For generations.
And that's franchise and Taft-Hartley have been the two innovations of capital that has really stopped unionization, and then after that, and then concurrent to that, deindustrialization. But those things are tied together, and so and as I pointed out, there are reasons why like schools, which still kind of function like factories, actually also still have unions that are kind of powerful. Same thing with hospitals. And yes, a lot of the unions are super reactionary because they're basically trade guilds. And we've always known trade guilds to be reactionary. Like we've been talking about this since before Marx. We've been talking about this.
Another reason why the party has to discipline them.
Right. But their interests are in what we have to offer.
Yes.
And if we're not offering it, then they're never going to be interested in it. And that's why we have to study the Second International. We have to bring the workers' movement back to life. That seems to be like, that's been my whole thing. It's like the merger formula only works if we resurrect the workers' movement. If we try to merge with nothing, then like
we try to merge with every other social movement, so we might as well go back to our original, like we gotta dance with the girl who brung us, or whatever that expression is.
All right. And with that note, well, you will be back on and we will probably talk more historical stuff, but this is a good background for the implications, because we haven't really actually talked about the conditions directly for World War II, and mentioning Grossman and Kautsky. Hopefully, people know who they are.
Right.
The
I know people are going to do
implications,
their homework. I know.
yeah, the implications of this now and why it matters now, because
Yeah.
there was also a chance. I do think in the 1930s there's a chance that capitalism for ending either in socialism or in something worse than fascism, maybe. It didn't happen. We both bit the bullet and dodged it simultaneously. So, and so now we have the same issue, and I think the Marxists actually do have to answer for why didn't, and I think we do have an answer, but no one wants to say it. Why didn't capitalism fall in the 1930s? Because everything that we believed, and it wasn't just Grossman. Okay, Grossman was just the biggest articulation of it. Came up with a mathematical theory of it that was cohesive. Everyone believed that the crisis was going to end capital one way or another, and the crises were going to get worse and worse. That was one thing that everybody agreed on, except for Bernstein.
Yeah, and that's wrong. It turns out that they would get worse. I mean, when you devalue capital, there's conditions for profitability, but then capital revaluates, or revalorizes, I should say.
Like 84, 96, 99, 2001, 2007, COVID. Come on, every cycle has gotten worse. So like
that's right. We're back there again. And this is another that's the rhyme. And if there's one headline from this, it's or at least there's one headline from this current project that I'm working on now, and it sort of has organized sort of everything I do. Believe it or not, I'm like my music history stuff is also completely organized by this, by revivifying this moment in history. It's this rhyme, this compelling, hard to ignore rhyme between the turn of the last century and this moment.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen. You will be a regular guest. We're actually going to talk about what in the future, probably around February, if I'm guessing, about why the Frankfurt School went wrong, which is literally your focus of research.
We're going to do that. We're going to do the Frankfurt School next time,
because I started off as a pro Frankfurt School guy. I still have a soft spot in my heart for Adorno. But when I actually did the research on the early history of the Frankfurt School, I had to admit something happened that was not good. And I couldn't say that Habermas alone, just like I couldn't say that the New Left alone was the problem. Habermas didn't begin the problem; he is the result of it.
We don't scapegoat on this.
Even though I do sort of think that Habermas is a traitor and should be condemned, like when we write the history of socialism, he should be in the list of bad names. But like the names that we say as ritual castigation, but like with LaSalle, Habermas, some other people that I'm gonna
the true demons. Yeah, right.
But
I can't wait. I really can't.
All right,
that sounds
so we'll
wonderful.
talk about that.
Thanks so much for the
Thank you for coming on. All right.